You step out into a narrow lane of packed earth, somewhere in medieval Europe, in a year that might be 1250 or 1350, when winter still feels less like a season and more like an exam that whole villages sit together. The sun has already slipped behind low hills, and the last of its light skims weakly over frozen ruts, turning puddles into dull plates of ice. Your breath ghosts in front of you, and your fingers sting as you reach out to touch the rough, warped wood of a cottage door. You probably won't survive these winters without shivering at least once, even if it's only here in imagination. From the clustered roofs of the village, thin grey smoke rises and drifts, lazily at first, and then more urgently as the air cools. Somewhere beyond the harvested fields, a church bell marks the end of daylight, its sound carrying over stubble and fallow plots toward these low timber houses. Chickens are being coaxed into coops, a pig squeals in protest as it's driven into a byre, and a dog shakes out its fur, scattering droplets that freeze almost as soon as they touch the ground. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you'd like, you can let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Imagine those modern clocks ticking far away from the slow, uncertain hours of this village. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand for a moment with your back to the village street, looking out over the fields that have just given the last of their strength. In much of northern and western Europe, the agricultural year has already wound down by Martinmas in early November. When peasants slaughter surplus animals, they cannot feed through the cold months. By the time hard frosts like this arrive, ploughs are put away, the last sheaves are in, and the countryside enters its waiting phase. The real work now is not sowing or reaping, but simply enduring. The cottage door in front of you is not straight, not snug, and certainly not windproof. The walls are a patchwork of wattle and daub-woven wooden stakes, smeared with a mixture of clay, straw, and dung that keeps out the worst of the weather, but never all of it. House here does not mean anything like the sealed, insulated spaces you know. Historians still debate just how cold it was inside such dwellings compared with outside, because documents are much more likely to record harvest yields than room temperatures, but almost all agree that indoors for poor peasants is a matter of slightly less cold, not guaranteed warmth. You lift the latch and step in. Low beams force you to duck. The air is thicker here, heavy with the smell of smoke, wool, and damp earth. There is warmth, but it feels fragile, local, almost shy. A single open hearth smoulders near the center of the room, its glow reddening the packed earth and the faces turned toward it. Above your head, the thatched roof is black with soot, rafters darkened by years of smoke curling up and finding its way through gaps instead of a proper chimney. You hear the faint hiss as a damp log releases its moisture into the fire. Outside, the world feels wide and dangerous. Inside, it shrinks to this low, crowded space. There are no glass windows here, those are for churches, and the houses of the wealthy only wooden shutters, or perhaps a square of oiled linen that can be closed against the wind. A crack in the door glows faintly with the last light from the yard. A gust squeezes through and makes the hanging bundles of herbs on the wall tremble. In exceptionally hard winters, like those that struck Europe during the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, when heavy rains and crop failures brought hunger even to normal. Years small drafts like this could matter terribly for infants, the elderly, and the already underfed. A woman edges past you, skirts brushing your legs, carrying a basket of kindling that looks pitifully small. Fuel is precious now. In many regions, nearby forests have been thinned or reserved, and poor villagers depend on scavenging fallen branches, cutting brush in hedgerows, or gathering dried cow and horse dung from the fields to use as fuel. Lords often claim strict rights over woodland, and manorial records preserve little disputes about who may gather deadwood or graze pigs among the trees on the surface. Minor quarrels. But underneath, fragments of a larger story about how people try to stay warm when fuel is scarce. You can feel that calculation humming quietly in the room. The hearth fire is not a roaring blaze, but a carefully nursed core of embers, brought to life only when needed for cooking or a little extra light. A child reaches toward the flames with a stick, more from curiosity than necessity, and is sharply warned not to waste wood. A man steps over, adds just one more piece, then steps back to watch that it catches, before settling again on a low bench. In his posture is the arithmetic everyone here carries in their heads. How many days until Candlemas in early February? How many bundles of brush stacked against the wall? How much grain left in the chest? Yet amid the tension, there is also routine, a choreography that repeats every year and has done so for generations. Muddy shoes are knocked against the threshold, clods of frozen earth tumbling onto the floor to be scraped away later. Tools lean in a corner, an ox yoke, a rake with worn teeth, a metal hoe, nicked and scarred from stones. They will rest now, until the ground softens again, but the people do not. The peasant's winter is not exactly idle. It is simply a different kind of work, much of it indoors, and much of it done with the cold pressing closer. From the church tower in the distance, another bell rings, perhaps for vespers, calling anyone who can spare the time to slip through the dark to stone walls and candlelight. The liturgical year and the farming year interlock here. Advent, Christmas, Epiphany, Lent, Easter, all threaded through with saints' days and local customs that slice the long winter into named portions. Some scholars think that these ceremonies and feasts provided not just religious comfort, but a psychological scaffolding for surviving the monotony and fear of the season, turning endless dark into a sequence of steps towards spring. The wind rises outside, and you hear it produce a low moan where it catches the edges of thatch and timber, like a giant animal sniffing at the walls. For a moment, you imagine life without electric lights, without radiators or heaters or sealed windows, only this skin of wood, earth, and straw between you and the cold. For medieval peasants, that sensation was normal, not dramatic. Winter was not a romantic backdrop. It was a force that could warp wood, crack stone, weaken the body, and sometimes quietly rearrange who survived to see another year. And yet, as you stand by the hearth and watch the small, steady motions of this household, the woman adjusting a pot so it sits in the warmest part of the coals, a man closing the shutter with practiced hands, a child curling up on a bench with a strip of wool to finger, there is also a stubborn calm. People here know that the cold will come whether they are ready or not, so they do what they can. Seal cracks with moss, hang extra cloth where the wind sneaks in, bring the most vulnerable closer to the fire when the frost is sharpest. The door you touched a moment ago, rough under your hand, is barred now. Outside, frost settles along its lower edge, drawing a pale line between inside and out. Tomorrow, and the day after, and for many weeks, that line will hold, imperfect, but real. On this first hard night, as darkness thickens over the villages and farmsteads of medieval Europe, you feel the whole landscape drawing inward, each small dwelling bracing itself quietly for the long work of surviving the cold. By the time morning returns, the frost has thickened into a thin, glittering crust over everything, and you can see your breath from the moment you stir. The cottage is still only half lit, the fire never allowed to die completely, just coaxed through the night under a blanket of ash. When someone pokes it awake and adds a scrap of kindling, the room brightens, and you feel the quiet, familiar pressure that always comes with late autumn. There is still fuel to gather before the real winter settles in. You step outside, boots or clogs crunching on frozen mud, and the world looks as though it has been dusted with ground glass. The fields that were brown and wet yesterday now shine faintly. Each stalk of stubble wears its own fragile sugar coating of ice. The trees along the hedgerows stand almost bare, a few last leaves clinging on, shivering in the pale light. This is the season when every branch and every clump of brush is suddenly visible, counted in the mind as potential warmth. The Lord's woodland lies beyond the open fields, a darker mass of trunks and tangled undergrowth, and you know there are rules about what can be taken there. In much of medieval Europe, Forests are not wild free-for-alls, but carefully managed resources, bound up in rights and prohibitions. The terminology differs from estovers in English manorial law, where tenants may have the right to take deadwood or underwood for fuel, to similar customary rights in French, German, and other lands, but the pattern is much the same. Certain people may cut certain kinds of wood, in certain ways, at certain times. Others risk fines, beatings, or confiscated bundles if they go too far. So you join a small group heading out along the track, carrying simple tools, a small axe perhaps, or a billhook for cutting brush, a rope for tying bundles. Children come too, their hands red in the cold, because fuel gathering is not an optional chore that can be left to a few. It is a kind of harvest in its own right, one that must be done between other labours, while the ground is still passable, and snow has not yet buried the smallest sticks. The path leads past hedges that have grown thick over generations, serving as living fences to keep animals in or out, and as silent fuel reserves. You watch as someone cuts the year's growth from a coppice tree, leaving the stump alive so it can sprout again. In parts of Europe where this practice is common, the landscape develops a rhythm of low, many-stemmed trees, whose repeated regrowth provides a steady supply of poles and branches. It's an efficient system, but it demands memory and discipline. Cut too much, too often, and the coppice weakens. Cut too little, and you go cold. Reaching the edge of the wood, you feel a change in the air. The light dims, the ground softens under a layer of leaves, and the smells grow more complicated. Damp soil, fungus, the faint resinous tang of fir or pine, if you are in regions where conifers grow. Here, the hierarchy of the village follows you among the trunks. Those with more rights or influence might be allowed to fell small trees for beams. Those with less are limited to fallen branches, brush, and prunings. A child bends to pick up a twig, then another, building a bundle one careful piece at a time. Not all fuel is wood, and not all regions rely on forests. In places where peat bogs lie within reach, peasants cut dark, crumbly slices of turf in drier months, stacking them to dry for winter use. You imagine the low, repetitive motion of the peat spade, the long rows of cut blocks drying in weak sun. And now, at this time of year, the satisfaction of carrying those lightened, brittle bricks home. In treeless or heavily deforested areas, dried dung becomes especially important. Women and children may have combed the summer pastures and roadside verges for it, shaping and stacking it near the house. To modernize, these fuels might seem poor and unpleasant, but to medieval peasants, they are simply part of the energy landscape, as normal as logs. As you move through the undergrowth, you notice that nothing is wasted. A gnarled root might be too awkward for the hearth now, but the smaller branches sprouting from it are stripped and bundled. Thin, straight twigs become kindling. Thicker limbs will be split at home. Even bramble stems are sometimes cut back, both to clear paths and to dry into a rough, crackling fuel for days when nothing better is left. Some historians argue that for many peasants, the medieval energy problem was less about sudden catastrophic deforestation and more about a steady, chronic shortfall in easily accessible fuel, a problem solved year after year by this mixture of ingenuity, careful rights, and sheer labour. You glance back toward the village and see thin lines of people dotting the landscape, each with their own small quota of warmth to gather. On some manors, written records note obligations or fines related to wood. A peasant who has taken more than his due, another granted the right to carry so many cartloads from a particular grove. These entries, dry on parchment, hide the more immediate reality you feel in your hands and muscles. The weight of a bundle of sticks, the sting of cold on your face, the dull ache in your shoulders after hours of carrying, and the quiet calculation of whether this will be enough. By mid-morning your fingers are stiff, but your bundle has grown. The rope bites into the wood as you cinch it tight. Others in your group do the same, and there's a moment of shared appraisal. No one says it outright, but you can sense it. Is this enough for 3 days? 5? Will we need to come out again before the next hard freeze? The answer is almost always yes. Winter fuel gathering is not a single dramatic expedition, but a series of small, repetitive journeys, fitting into the cracks of the agricultural calendar. On the way back, the sun is higher, but its warmth is more a suggestion than a fact. You pass the open fields, now under the Lord's eye, in a different way. After the harvest, poor peasants are sometimes allowed to glean, collect leftover grain stalks from the stubble, another essential winter survival tactic. Though often tightly regulated, you notice how easily grain and fuel blur together in your thoughts. Heat and food, wood and grain, are twin pillars of survival, each dependent on the choices made in autumn. Inside the village again, you see other forms of fuel piled against walls. Brushwood leaning like upside-down brooms, a little stack of peat, neat rows of faggots, uniform bundles of sticks tied for convenience. In some regions, communal ovens or bakehouses also devour fuel, and arrangements are required. Who contributes brush? Who buys or provides wood? Who bakes when? Even at this small scale, fuel is social. It is measured not only in bundles, but in relationships, obligations, and bargains. When you finally shrug the bundle from your shoulder at the cottage door, the sensation is almost dizzying. The inside smells the same: smoke, wool, damp earth. But now there is the added scent of fresh-cut wood and crushed leaves clinging to your clothes. Someone inside looks quickly at what you've brought, mentally adding it to the existing store. The stack along the wall, the coarse basket of twigs, the few precious larger logs reserved for the coldest nights or the longest boils. No one applauds. This is not a heroic act. It is just what must be done. As afternoon light thins and the breath of winter grows sharper in the air, you feel the village settling again into its pattern. Fieldwork paused, fuel gathered, animals tended, paths beginning to freeze. Somewhere in a manor hall or a townhouse, the wealthy can rely on larger hearths, better access to wood, maybe even imported coal in later medieval centuries. For the peasants around you, survival is built from these small, repeated excursions, each one pulling a little more stored sunlight in the form of wood, peat, or dung into the fragile circle of warmth around the hearth. The frost outside may be thickening, testing every crack and gap in the walls, but with each bundle you carry in, you quietly redraw the line between cold and not quite so cold. The landscape around the village might seem frozen and still, yet you now know how much hidden motion lies beneath. The slow, continuous work of gathering the winter's last fuel before the snow makes the world heavier, quieter, and harder. Evening slides in again, almost before you've really noticed the day, the light vanishing quickly, as if the sky is also trying to huddle down somewhere warm. You step back into the cottage with the others, and this time, you are more aware of how the space itself is working to keep you alive, or at least, a little less cold. Once the door is barred, the boundaries of your world narrow to a single room. For many poor peasants across medieval Europe, especially in the High Middle Ages, between about 1000 and 1300, home is exactly this. One multi-purpose space where cooking, eating, sleeping, working, and waiting for spring all crowd together. In parts of England, Germany, and France, excavations of simple timber houses, like those at the deserted village of Wharram Percy in Yorkshire, show small, rectangular buildings, often with just one main room, flanked by a tiny service area or byre. The basic idea is remarkably similar across regions. Fewer walls means less surface for the cold to creep through, and more bodies in one volume of air means more shared warmth. You feel that logic in your bones as people move around you. The fire, low in the center or along one wall, glows with a steady, reddish light. It never quite reaches the corners. There, shadows pool quietly. A bench runs along part of the wall, and someone has spread a rough woolen cloth over it, creating a sitting and sleeping space in one. Above, a wooden beam supports hanging objects, pots, tools, bunches of drying herbs, each one casting a tiny shadow that shifts as the fire flickers. There is nowhere here for privacy to hide. A couple murmurs in one corner, sharing a short joke about the dog that has curled up too close to the hearth. Children squabble softly over a place nearest the warmth. An older woman sits on a low stool, mending a tunic, her fingers moving with that tired, automatic efficiency that comes from repeating the same motions for decades. The single-room house compresses all stages of life into one visible, audible space. You can't help but be aware of everyone else. In some regions, especially in the colder north and west, houses are arranged so that animals share this tight world. In parts of Scandinavia, what scholars call longhouses combine human living quarters and byres under one roof, with a partition or low wall between. In alpine areas, too, there are houses raised above a stable, so the heat from below seeps upward. Here, in your imagined village, the animals might occupy a lean-to attached to the main room or an open area at one end. Either way, the effect is the same. Their body heat adds to the fragile warmth, their breath puffing in soft clouds in the coldest hours. To modern sensibilities, it may seem unsanitary, but to villagers balancing warmth, security, and limited materials, it is practical. You watch as people adjust themselves for the night, as carefully as they manage the fire. Little by little, tasks that can be done upright are finished: last repairs, last scraping out of the pot, last check that the door is secured. Then bodies begin to settle, some on wooden benches against the wall, others on low platforms of boards, a few simply on straw laid over the packed earth. Coarse blankets, old cloaks, and spare garments are layered thickly. It is not one person to a bed, but several. Children tuck themselves against older relatives, sometimes 3 or 4 to a pallet. The warmth that radiates from so many bodies is subtle but real, and you feel it slowly accumulate as people stop moving. In this one room you can sense another kind of map, traced not by walls but by proximity and rank. Parents, infants, and the very old are closest to the hearth or the least drafty wall. Adolescents and able-bodied adults can afford to be nearer the door or the outer wall where the cold presses hardest. In households that take in a landless labourer or poor relation, that person often ends up in the least comfortable spot. Historians sometimes interpret this choreographed closeness as a physical expression of social hierarchy, but it is also simple practicality. You put the most fragile where the warmth is thickest. You notice, too, how much of this arrangement is built into the house itself. The walls lean slightly inward, the roof heavy with thatch, like a person drawing a cloak tighter. That thatch is not just shelter from rain. Its thickness insulates, trapping rising warmth and slowing the escape of air. In many peasant houses, there is no chimney as you'd recognize one, at least not until later centuries. Smoke from the open hearth rises into the roof space and then drifts toward gaps or a small louver. The result is a permanent smoky haze, stinging eyes and darkening rafters. Some scholars have suggested that long-term exposure to this smoke damaged lungs and eyes, contributing to chronic health problems. Yet at the same time it helped preserve the thatch from insects and rot. Even here, comfort and harm are intertwined in ways no one can fully untangle. You stretch out on a straw-filled pallet near the wall and feel the unevenness of the floor beneath. Medieval peasants do not sleep on thick mattresses, but on whatever padding they can assemble, straw or reeds, sometimes mixed with a little chaff, held in a rough linen or hempen sack if they can afford cloth. Over time, the straw breaks down and must be replaced. Another small but necessary chore. The scent of it, dry, dusty, with a faint sweetness, mixes with the sharpness of smoke and the warm, animal smell of so many people sharing a confined space. Outside, the wind pushes against the walls, and now and again a draught finds a way in, stroking along the floor like an invisible cat. Where floor meets wall, someone has stuffed moss, old rags, or even dung plaster to block the worst cracks. In wealthier houses, wooden planks or stone might form the floor. In poorer ones, like this, it is compacted earth, sometimes renewed with a thin layer of clay. It is not a perfect seal, but every small effort helps shift the balance a little more in favour of those lying here. As the room begins to quiet, you become aware of a low chorus of sounds that will carry through many winter nights. The creak of timber as the house adjusts to temperature changes, the faint whistle of wind through the smallest gaps, the soft mutter of someone shifting in sleep, the occasional cough that reminds you how easily cold air irritates lungs already tested by smoke and labour. In the centuries, when Europe begins to edge into what later historians call the Little Ice Age, from roughly the 14th century onward, these sounds take on an extra weight, as colder, more unpredictable winters make indoor warmth even more uncertain. But people don't talk in those terms. They simply feel that the cold bites more sharply some years than others, and that the old tricks must be used even more carefully. Somewhere in the darkness, a child whimpers, involuntarily recalling a nightmare. A hand reaches out, half asleep, and pulls the child closer to a warm body. In a space like this, comfort does not travel far. It is carried skin to skin, shared through touch and nearness. Privacy, as you understand it, barely exists, yet the constant awareness of one another also means that fear, loneliness, and cold are rarely faced entirely alone. Some historians argue that this intimacy, forced by architecture and necessity, shaped medieval notions of family and community just as much as religion or law did, binding people together simply because separation was physically impossible. You lie there, listening to the house settle, feeling the thin but persistent warmth from the hearth and from so many sleeping bodies. The walls may be crooked, the roof smoky, the bed lumpy, and the draught stubborn, but within this one crowded room, a whole strategy of survival is unfolding. Bodies, heat, space, and social ties are arranged as carefully as bundles of firewood, each piece doing what it can to push back, just a little, against the long winter night, pressing in from outside. The night goes on, and you become increasingly aware of the way the cold seems to search for you, feeling along every seam and gap as if it has fingers of its own. It does not rush in like a storm. It seeps, patient and relentless. Lying there on the straw in the half-dark, you start to notice just how many layers stand between your skin and the winter air, and how each one has been thought about, mended, and repurposed until nothing more can be squeezed from it. You never undressed before getting into bed. As a poor peasant in much of medieval Europe, you don't have a separate set of nightclothes. What you wear by day is what you sleep in by night, especially during the winter months. Underneath, if you are relatively fortunate, there is a linen or hempen shirt, long enough to reach mid-thigh or lower, the one garment that touches your skin directly. Over that, a simple woolen tunic or kirtle, thicker and scratchier, dyed a muted brown, grey, or dull blue with inexpensive plant dyes. The seams are a little stiff where they've been repaired, and patches of slightly different colour show where new cloth has been sewn onto old. Wool is your constant companion. Across northern and western Europe, from the 11th to the 15th centuries, flocks of sheep graze the same hills that peasants harvest for grain. Their wool is spun and woven into cloth that ends up in all layers of society, from fine, richly dyed fabric in town markets to coarse, homespun stuff like the garments piled on this bed. You might not think about the thriving trade in English wool that helps fill the coffers of kings or the busy fulling mills in cloth towns. What you know is that a thicker tunic means the wind bites a little less, and that a lining of rough wool in a hood can mean the difference between tolerable and unbearable. Around your shoulders now is a cloak, once perhaps better, now frayed at the edges, its fastening a simple tie or a cheap metal brooch. Someone has sewn patches over thin spots, small, uneven shapes, cut from worn-out clothing that had already lived a long life of their own. This is where the idea of patchwork warmth becomes real, not the refined quilts of later centuries with intricate patterns, but a humble, pragmatic mosaic of cloth that exists because throwing anything away would be unthinkable. Old sleeves become panels, torn hems are trimmed into usable strips. A worn-out hood might be cut into smaller pieces to reinforce elbows or cover a hole. Beneath you, the straw crackles softly as you shift. The mattress is not a single, luxurious object, but a sack or loose heap of straw spread on boards or directly on the packed earth. Over time, the straw breaks, flattens, and compacts, making the bed harder. In some households, it is replaced at least once a year, often around major feasts, when people are already cleaning and refreshing their homes. The medieval expression about hitting the hay would make immediate sense to you if anyone were to say it. As you breathe in, you catch the faint smell of dry plants and dust, with just a hint of last summer's fields still clinging to it. On top of you, another layer goes down a thick, homespun blanket, maybe two. The weave is loose enough that you can feel small irregularities under your fingers, but dense enough to hold pockets of air. Air, trapped in fibers and between layers, is the real secret to warmth. Everyone here knows it without having to name it. That's why there is such an effort to add layers, rather than relying on a single heavy piece. Over the blanket comes an old cloak, too worn for daily use outside, now repurposed as night covering. Then perhaps a battered woolen shawl, originally made for a grandmother, now shared by whoever is coldest. Here and there, fur appears, but usually not the rich, glamorous pelts you see in paintings of nobles. European sumptuary laws and unwritten customs often reserve the best furs, like ermine and vair, for elites. In this room, if there is fur at all, it is more likely sheepskin or lambskin, perhaps a few scraps of rabbit sewn into the lining of a hood or onto the inside of a pair of mittens. If someone has managed to keep a whole sheepskin as a bed cover, it will be prized and carefully preserved, the hide side crackled with age, the wool side worn flat where many bodies have lain against it. Someone near you pulls on a hood or cap before settling fully to sleep. Covering the head at night is a simple, effective way to retain heat, especially in drafty houses where the air near the roof is smoky but still cold. If you are lucky, you also have long woolen hose or wraps for your lower legs, making it easier to face the contact of cold straw. No one here would consider bare feet on winter nights a sign of toughness. It would simply be foolish. A conspiratorial little aside runs through your mind. People, centuries from now, might pay extra for rustic drafty rooms, but you know that given a choice, any peasant would gladly trade this patchwork arrangement for a solid wall and a thick featherbed. In wealthier homes, perhaps at the manor house on the hill, the arrangements are different. There, under the same winter sky of, say, January 1300, a lord and lady may sleep in a curtained bed with a proper frame, cords, and a thick mattress of straw or feathers, covered by multiple fine wool and linen layers, sometimes with decorative quilts. Bed curtains help hold warmth in, and the fire in a stone fireplace can be larger and more sustained. Yet even there, people still sleep in caps and layers, and the stone walls themselves radiate cold. Historians sometimes suggest that the basic thermal experience of winter, of one's breath frosting in the air, of relying on layers and bedfellows, was shared more broadly across classes than many other aspects of medieval life. Back in this cottage, you feel how social that warmth is. 2 or 3 people share your pallet. Their breath warms the small space just above the covers. When one shifts, the others adjust instinctively, creating a compact little bundle of bodies and cloth. Children wedge themselves into spaces between adults, the way kittens pile in a nest. On the harshest nights, everyone squeezes closer, not out of sentiment, but necessity. The bed is less a personal piece of furniture and more like a communal nest, a living object that changes shape with the season and the number of bodies it holds. Around the edges of the room, other makeshift insulations quietly do their part. An old sack stuffed with rags is propped against the most draft-prone part of the wall. A woven mat lies in front of the door to catch the worst of the cold rolling along the floor. Occasionally, someone tucks an extra scrap of cloth into a crack, muttering that the wind has found a new hole. These are tiny interventions, but multiplied over many points, they change the feel of the room. Some scholars argue that this cumulative creativity, what one might call vernacular insulation, deserves just as much attention as the grand architecture of castles and cathedrals. When we think about how medieval people experienced climate, you breathe carefully, feeling the coarse texture of the blanket under your fingers. At first, the cold still seems to seep through everything, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, the warmth builds. The straw under you reflects a little of your body heat back. The layered cloth holds more. The bodies pressed close add their own. The air near your face is still cool, but no longer biting. This is not comfort as you know it from central heating. It is a truce, a fragile one, between your patchworks and the season outside. As your eyes grow heavy, you realize that in this world, wealth is not measured only in coins or land, but in the number of usable layers hanging on pegs and folded in chests. A family that has a few extra blankets, a decent cloak, a wool-lined hood, and enough cloth to stuff the window gaps is already materially safer than one that does not. Memory, too, becomes a kind of insulation. The remembered advice of older generations on how to stuff the mattress, where to hang the extra cloth, when to patch rather than discard. Wrapped now in the cumulative efforts of many hands and many winters, you drift towards sleep. Outside, frost crawls silently over the roofs and hedges, pressing its face to the shutters. Inside, straw, rags, wool, and worn-out cloaks form a thin but resolute frontier, keeping skin and bone just far enough from the deep bite of the cold to allow dreams. At some point in the long night, even wrapped in all those layers, you become acutely aware of the fragile glow a few steps away. The hearth is never entirely out of your mind. It is as though a small, living creature occupies the middle of the room, needing constant, quiet attention. When someone stirs and rises, shuffling across the straw, you hear them kneel by the hearth and gently stir the ash, coaxing a tired orange eye back into fuller wakefulness. By the time full morning comes again, the hearth's shape reveals itself in better light. It is not a tidy, enclosed stove, but a simple arrangement, a shallow depression in the packed earth, or a slightly raised platform of stone or clay, set where sparks are least likely to leap onto wooden beams or thatch. In some regions, especially by the high Middle Ages, the hearth is placed against a wall with a hood and flue above to catch smoke. In poorer, older houses, it may still sit nearer the centre, smoke greeting the rafters before threading its way out through roof vents and gaps. You crouch beside it, feeling how the fire marks the true centre of this world. The house is not organised around beds or tables, but around this patch of heat and light. Pots hang from an iron hook or rest on a simple trivet. A blackened cauldron, scarred from years of use, stands ready for whatever the household can spare to simmer. The stones around the hearth are dark, glossy in places where fat has splattered, dull and flaking where heat has bitten them over and over. Today's first task is simple and always the same: keep the fire alive. In many medieval villages, letting the hearth go out is serious, even shameful. Without flint and steel readily on hand in every house, and without matches or lighters, making a new flame is laborious and uncertain. People guard their embers jealously, banking them under ash at night to keep them smouldering, then stirring them awake at dawn. If the fire does die, a child might be sent with a covered pot to a neighbour's cottage to beg a glowing coal, carrying it back carefully through the cold air like a tiny, precious treasure. You feed the fire with the sticks you helped gather yesterday. There is a deliberate order to it. Smallest twigs first, then slightly thicker pieces. Then, once the flames are steady, a larger log or chunk of peat. Dung cakes, if used here, burn with a particular, acrid smell that clings to clothing and hair. Peat gives off a heavy, earthy smoke. Green wood hisses and spits as its moisture escapes. Nothing about this is careless. Every piece of fuel placed on the fire is measured against the winter still ahead. Some historians note that in accounts of household management, women are often described as keeping the fire, a phrase that encompasses not only cooking but the quiet, constant arithmetic of fuel economy, deciding what can be spared for warmth, what must be saved for cooking, and when a dim fire is the safest choice. As the morning turns to midday, the hearth's role broadens from survival to rhythm. A pot of pottage thick, slow-cooked stew of grains, legumes, and any scraps of vegetables or meat hangs over the heat. In many peasant households, this dish is nearly constant in winter, gradually enriched or thinned depending on what is available. You watch as a handful of barley or oats is added, then a few shreds of cabbage, maybe a small piece of bacon or salted pork if today is lucky, and not a strict religious fast. The smell of it fills the room. Earthy, comforting, repetitive. Bread, too, is bound up with the hearth, even if it is not always baked here. In parts of medieval Europe, Particularly in towns and some villages, communal ovens serve multiple households. On designated days, people bring their shaped loaves, marked with distinctive cuts or symbols, to identify ownership and pay a small fee or fulfill an obligation to the lord or oven keeper. But even when the actual baking takes place elsewhere, dough is mixed and kneaded by this hearth, the heat used to help it rise, cloths warm to drape over it. The fire's warmth is indirect but essential, a partner in turning grain into something that can sustain life through the cold. As you sit close, you become acutely aware of the trade-off that every medieval peasant makes: warmth and cooking in exchange for smoke. There is no clear glass to separate flame from air, no metal stove drawing fumes away. The smoke swirls around you, rising in slow, bluish ribbons, thickening near the roof where it pools, before slipping out through whatever openings it can find. Your eyes sting. Your lungs feel a faint scratchiness at the back of your throat. Inhaling this every day, year after year, must leave its mark. Some modern scholars suggest that chronic respiratory problems were common in such environments, though the records, focused on great events and noble lives, rarely dwell on the rasp of a peasant's breath. You notice how the house itself bears the history of these fires. Rafters are blackened and shiny in places, almost varnished by smoke. The thatch, darker near the peak, may be more resistant to pests because of it. A small, unintended benefit. Tools and pots near the hearth have a permanent patina of soot. Even skins and fabrics hung nearby, to dry or cure absorb the smell. The hearth is not just a place. It is a slow, smoky painter, tinting everything in its reach with shades of grey and brown. As afternoon draws on and the light begins once again to thin, the hearth takes on its evening role. People drift closer as the cold sneaks back into corners. Work that can be done here is chosen: carding wool, spinning with a drop spindle, whittling small wooden items, mending harness or footwear. A child sits cross-legged, trying clumsily to twist straw into a rope under an elder's guidance. Conversation moves in gentle ripples, news from neighbouring villages, the health of animals, rumours of a harsh winter 2 valleys over, memories of the famine years when, around 1316, rains ruined crops and fires dried thin gruel in empty pots. Sometimes, in towns, a curfew bell rings from the church or castle, its name derived from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire, reminding inhabitants to bank their hearths, damp down flames, and reduce the risk of nighttime conflagrations in timbered streets. Out here in the village, you might not hear such a bell, but the practice is much the same. As night deepens, someone carefully rearranges the fire, pulling embers together, placing a protective layer of ash atop them so they will smoulder rather than flare. This practice reflects a shared understanding that uncontrolled fire is as much a danger as cold, especially in houses where one stray spark could turn a thatched roof into an instant torch. Sitting by the hearth in the thickening dark, you sense how much community is shaped here. Stories are told in its light, from saints' lives that mix moral lessons with miracle tales, to local legends about lights seen on the moors or strange noises in the woods. Children absorb these stories, along with the choreography of tending the fire: how to lay wood so it catches without wasting, how to read the colour and behaviour of flames, how to judge when a pot is at a simmer rather than a boil in the flickering light. Some historians argue that the hearth was a school as much as a stove, a place where skills, beliefs, and memories were passed from generation to generation without ever being written down. In the far corners of Europe, arrangements differ: the clay stoves of some eastern regions, the enclosed masonry heaters that begin to appear in certain Alpine and Baltic areas in later centuries. But the pattern holds: a concentrated source of heat that also structures daily life. Here, in your small, smoky cottage, you can't imagine a day without circling back to this glowing centre. When finally the time comes to sleep again, the fire is once more banked carefully. Only a faint, reddish pulse remains under its blanket of ash. The room grows darker, colder at the edges, but the memory of that warmth lingers on your skin. You know that as long as those hidden embers survive the night, morning will bring flame again with a few gentle breaths and a careful stick. Historians still debate many aspects of medieval peasant life: diet, disease, even how often people truly went hungry. But the centrality of the hearth is one of the few points where there is little disagreement, whether in a one-room cottage or a more elaborate hall. Fire is the heart that must be fed, the eye that must be watched, and the circle around which poor peasants in winter gather their labour, their stories, and their hope that this cold season, like all the others before it, will eventually yield to spring. By now you've learned that warmth does not come from fire alone. It comes from what sits in your belly, from how many hours it has been since you last swallowed something solid, from whether the heaviness behind your ribs is the weight of bread or the ache of emptiness. As the winter deepens, you start to notice that the hunger is always there, like a low background hum, rising and falling, but never completely silent. The next morning, you are drawn once more toward the hearth, but this time not just for heat. The big black pot that hung over the fire yesterday still hangs there, its sides crusted where pottage dried and clung overnight. Someone stirs its contents with a long wooden ladle, chipping off softened bits that slide back into the simmering mix. This pot is not emptied and washed each day. It is more like a living thing, continually altered, fed, and thinned. What you eat now is partly what you ate yesterday and the day before. Inside, you find a thick, porridge-like stew of grains and whatever else the household can spare. Barley, oats, or rye form the base wheat. Being more valuable is often reserved for bread and for the wealthy. Bits of onion or leek float to the surface, lending a sharp fragrance. On a good day, there might be a few shreds of salted pork or bacon, or the occasional bone to add flavour. On a church fast day, which comes often in the medieval calendar, those animal traces vanish, replaced by more vegetables, peas, or beans when they are available. The church cycle of feasts and fasts shapes the rhythm of meat and no meat, almost as surely as the seasons do. And some historians see in this not only spiritual discipline, but a built-in, if imperfect, form of rationing. You take your portion in a wooden bowl, using a piece of coarse bread as both spoon and food. The bread is dark, heavy, and slightly sour, made from rye, barley, or a mix called maslin. When wheat and rye are grown and baked together, its crust is hard enough that you must tear at it with your teeth. This is not the white, airy loaf of paintings and banquet tables. This is dense, practical bread that sticks to your ribs and slowly releases energy through the day. For many peasants across medieval Europe, historians agree, such bread and pottage, perhaps a little cheese, form the bulk of daily calories. Meat appears, but not nearly as often as your imagination of roasted medieval feasts would suggest. You sip something to wash it down, and your tongue is met not by water but by ale thin, slightly sour, low in alcohol. In a world where surface water is often contaminated by animals, waste, and runoff from fields, lightly fermented drinks offer some protection. The brewing process, however rudimentary, involves boiling or near boiling, and the mild alcohol and acidity can inhibit some microorganisms. This small beer, or weak ale, is not a luxury. It is a staple. Children drink it, old people drink it. Everyone drinks it, not with the aim of drunkenness, but of staying hydrated and taking in a few extra calories from the malt. The ale is cloudy, with bits of grain and yeast suspended in it, and it smells faintly of cereal and smoke. Your first instinct might be to long for clear water, but for peasants in many regions, this is what safe tastes like. Brewing is often done at home on a small scale, though larger manors and towns have their own brew houses. In some villages, records show women known as alewives, responsible for making and selling ale under local regulations. Fines appear in manorial court rolls when ale is found to be weak or unfairly priced dry. Bureaucratic hints that this murky drink is one of the village's most closely watched necessities. As you eat and drink, you are aware of how carefully portions are measured. The granary or chest where the family's grain is stored is not a bottomless well. It is a diminishing line that must stretch until the next harvest, often with a dangerous, hungry gap in late winter and early spring, when supplies run low and new growth has not yet reached the pot. In some parts of northern Europe, February earns a reputation as a hard month, sometimes nicknamed in local speech, with phrases that translate to the hunger month or the wolf month, hinting at both physical and psychological strain. You glance at the grain container against the wall, perhaps a sturdy wooden chest or a clay-lined pit dug into the ground. Its contents are carefully guarded from damp, vermin, and theft. Every scoop taken from it is a decision. If a handful is added to the pot today to make the pottage richer, that same handful will not be there 2 months from now, when the last rations are tallied. Some household heads are known for strictness, doling out portions with unbending discipline. Others are more generous in the early weeks, only to find themselves desperate later. Historians, reading between lines of tithes, fines, and letters, still argue about whether medieval peasants usually hovered on the brink of famine, or whether, in many normal years, they managed a modest but sufficient diet. What is clear is that the memory of bad years, like the Great Famine of 1315, 1317, never fully leaves people's minds. On days when food is scarcer, the pottage gets thinner, more water, fewer solids. Bread slices shrink. Cheese, made from the milk surplus of warmer months, is rationed more tightly or reserved for those doing the heaviest labor. A soft, fresh cheese might appear in early winter. By late winter, you may be scraping at the hardened edge of an old wheel, its rind tough but still precious. The body learns to accept monotony. Variety in the diet is a blessing, not a right. You think of meat and realize how rarely it arrives in your bowl. Most animals kept by peasants are too valuable as working power or sources of milk, wool, and offspring to be eaten frequently. Pigs, which can be fattened on scraps and forest mast, are more likely candidates, particularly around Martinmas in November, when many households slaughter one to salt or smoke for winter. After those first rich days of fresh pork, however, what remains is preserved and doled out sparingly, a chunk chopped into pottage for flavor, a bit of fat used to grease a pan or enrich a special dish at Christmas or on a saint's day. When meat appears on ordinary days, it often signals something out of the ordinary. A sick animal culled, an animal shared after a neighbor's slaughter, or, in the worst cases, desperation. You scrape the last of the pottage from your bowl and find that, though your stomach is not exactly empty, it is not truly full either. There is a space inside that never quite feels satisfied during winter. It sharpens on days when work is heavy and portions are small, when extra fuel is needed for body heat but cannot easily be provided. Children complain of hunger, then learn not to, understanding from the set of adults' shoulders that there is no hidden store waiting to be produced. Still, there are small strategies. When fresh produce vanishes from fields and gardens, preserved foods take their place. Cabbages stored in pits, onions and garlic, braided and hung from beams, turnips and parsnips kept in cool corners. These are far from the bright vegetables of summer, but they add flavor and a little nourishment. Grains are sometimes turned into gruels and pancakes to create the sense of something new, even if the ingredients are the same. On some days, when bread is too precious, people eat more of these mushes and less of the loaves. In between meals, the thin ale appears again, filling the void between hunger and fullness, keeping lips wet and throats from parching in smoky rooms. Taken in small, steady amounts, it helps sustain daily labor and warmth without, in most cases, causing drunkenness. There are stories, of course, of those who overindulge, just as there are church sermons warning about gluttony and drink. But, for most peasants in winter, the line between enough and too much is drawn not by moral teaching but by scarcity. You cannot drink yourself senseless when every batch of ale consumes grain or malt that might otherwise be eaten. As evening approaches and you sit once more by the hearth, waiting for the pot to return to a slow boil, you realize how deeply food and heat are intertwined. A body with enough calories burns warmer, A body that has lost weight to a string of lean winters feels the cold in its bones. Some scholars suggest that the psychological experience of winter hunger, the constant negotiation between now and later, between full and merely not empty, may have shaped peasant attitudes toward feasts as much as religion did, making Christmas, Carnival, and other periods of relative abundance not just celebrations but brief, vital reversals of a long, grey pattern. You look at your bowl, your bread, your cup of weak ale, and see not only what they are, but what they represent. A careful balancing act carried out one sip, one bite, one ladleful at a time. In this fragile economy of warmth, the crackling hearth and the simmering pot work together. One keeps your hands from stiffening, the other keeps your body from slowly consuming itself to stay alive. By now you're used to the sounds of the house at night, the creaking timbers, the occasional cough, the quiet murmur of voices. But one evening, as the sky darkens early and the air outside turns keen as a blade, a different kind of noise swells at the edge of the yard. Hooves scrape, pigs grunt and squeal, chickens cluck in indignant bursts. The household is doing something that, to you, might seem strange at first and perfectly practical after. They are bringing the animals in. You stand in the doorway as the procession arrives. A cow lumbers forward, breath steaming in thick clouds that billow in the freezing air. Her flanks are damp where snow has melted against her hide, and her smell hits you strong, warm, a mix of dung, hay, and animal heat that feels almost shocking after the thin, icy air outside. A smaller calf trails close, nudged along by a stick and a few firm words. Behind them, a pig, low, bristly, eyes bright, resists for a moment before finally trotting into the dim interior, hooves clattering on the threshold. In many parts of medieval Europe, especially in colder or upland regions, human living space and animal shelter are joined in one structure. Archaeologists working on sites in places like Dartmoor, in England, or in rural Norway and Iceland, have uncovered the remains of long, narrow buildings, where one end housed people and the other their cattle, with only a low dividing wall or passage between. In German-speaking areas, something similar appears later, as the Einhaus, literally one house for both humans and animals. Not every village and not every region follows this pattern. Some peasants use separate barns or byres instead. But the idea of animals sharing, or nearly sharing, a roof with people is far from unusual. Inside, the house rearranges itself to receive these heavy, living guests. At one end, perhaps slightly lower than the main floor, a byre waits with a stone or packed earth channel to carry away liquid waste. Wooden stakes or simple stalls mark where the cows will stand. Someone spreads fresh straw, clean enough for tonight, knowing it will be soiled by morning and then gathered up to be used as manure on the fields come spring. The pig is tethered to a post, grumbling, and given a nosing of scraps. Chickens flutter up to a beam or a rough perch to roost, their claws scratching softly on the wood. At first, the sounds and smells feel overwhelming. Hooves thump and shift. A cow's tail flicks against the timber. The pig snorts and roots. A chicken startles and sends a little rain of dust onto someone's cloak. The air grows thicker, heavy with the sharp tang of animal breath, the sourness of dung, the sweet dryness of hay. But along with that comes something else you feel in a few minutes. The temperature changes. It is subtle, but real. The byre end of the building is warmer than the wind-scoured yard outside, and that warmth slowly seeps through the thin dividing wall toward the human sleeping space. You can see the logic plainly. A cow is not just a future source of milk, traction, or meat. She is also, in a way, a big, solid furnace, constantly burning fodder into heat. In winter, when fodder is carefully rationed, you would never feed a cow just to warm your toes. But as long as she must be kept alive until spring for her economic value, you might as well let her warmth work for you too. Some historians, looking at the layout of longhouses and byre houses, point out that this arrangement is not just about comfort, but about security. A valuable animal is much harder to steal or injure when it is literally under the same roof as its owners. You watch as the animals settle. Cows stand head to head, their sides almost touching, chewing slowly, jaws rotating with that calming, repetitive motion. Each exhalation sends a puff of steam into the dim air. The pig circles a few times before flopping down on its own bed of straw, giving a satisfied grunt that sounds surprisingly human. Chickens tuck their heads under their wings, bodies puffed into feathery balls. The combined heat they give off begins to soften the bite of the cold that seeps under the door. You feel it as you step from the people's side of the room toward the byre. The floor is still hard, the air still cool, but no longer merciless. Not everyone is pleased by this closeness. You can imagine the complaints, the smell, the flies when weather turns, the noise before dawn when animals shift, bellow, or crow. The danger of disease passing between species is something medieval villagers recognize in their own way. Even if they do not name bacteria or parasites, they know that a sick cow's breath can be bad, that muck must be cleared regularly, that milk from a diseased animal should be handled with care. Scholars today discuss whether close quarters with animals increase the risk of certain illnesses among rural populations, but they also note that keeping beasts sheltered and fed through winter was the only way to have them available for milk, ploughing, or breeding once spring returned. The bargain between health, smell, warmth, and survival is messy, and no one has a perfectly clean answer. You crouch near the low wall that separates people from beasts, and you can feel that bargain in the straw under your hand. It is damp in spots, freshly scattered in others. The manure that will be cleaned out later is not just waste. It is raw material. In many medieval farming systems, especially mixed arable pastoral ones, manure is essential to maintain soil fertility, spread over fields in spring to replace nutrients taken by successive crops. Bringing animals indoors concentrates that manure, making it easier to collect. A peasant might look at the muck in the byre and see not just dirt to be endured, but future harvests in a more compact form. When bedtime comes, people retreat to their corner of the house, but the line between human and animal space is thin. A child pauses to pat the warm flank of a cow before curling up on their pallet. Someone checks that the pig's tether is secure, so it won't wander into the living area in the night. The sounds of the byre become part of the lullaby of the cottage. The slow, rhythmic chewing, the occasional clink of a tether chain, the rustle of straw as a heavy body shifts. In the darkest hours, when the wind keens outside and frost creeps higher on the door, these noises remind you that you are not facing the cold alone. In some regions, the arrangement is vertical rather than horizontal. People sleep in a loft or upper floor above animals, especially in alpine valleys where wooden houses stand over stone-walled stables. There, the heat rises directly through the floorboards, and the smell rises with it. In others, animals remain outdoors in separate barns, and their warmth never reaches the living room. Historians caution against imagining one uniform medieval pattern. Practices differ with climate, landscape, building traditions, and local custom. But wherever the two worlds do overlap, the experience is likely similar to what you feel here. Cramped, noisy, pungent, and undeniably warmer than the alternative. Lying on your straw pallet that night, listening to the soft thud of a hoof and the faint rattle of a tether, you realize how thoroughly survival has braided human and animal lives together. The same creatures that pull your plough and provide milk also help keep you from freezing. The same manure that dirties the floor tonight will nourish next year's rye. In this fragile architecture of winter survival, they are not just property or future meat. They are, for these months at least, your unwitting partners in holding a small circle of tolerable air against the deep, indifferent cold beyond the door. The animal's breathing settles into a slow rhythm behind the low wall, and outside the last colour slips from the sky, leaving only a deep, iron grey. It would be easy to think that with darkness, the day ends. But in this cottage, and in thousands like it across medieval Europe, you feel that the day is only changing shape. Work does not stop when the sun does. It simply moves closer to the fire. Someone pokes the banked embers and adds a little fuel, just enough to coax a flame without wasting too much wood. The room brightens into that familiar, flickering half-light, where the corners stay shadowed and the middle glows in shifting gold and smoke. On some evenings, you have only the fire itself. On others, a tallow candle is lit. A simple wick of twisted fibre dipped over and over in rendered animal fat until it thickens into a pale, greasy cylinder. The smell is strong, a little sour, and when the flame catches, it sputters, sending up a thin thread of smoke. Beeswax candles, clean and sweet, are for churches and the wealthy. Here, fat from pigs and sheep becomes both food and light. Sometimes, instead of a candle, a rushlight is used, the pith of a marsh plant, dried and soaked in fat, then set in a small clamp by the hearth. It burns quickly and unevenly, but it is cheap, and you can imagine whole villages lit by these wavering, smoky flames for centuries. This is not light that invites reading or delicate handiwork for long. It is just enough to see your fingers, your tools, your place in the weaving or the mending. Around the fire, the room gently rearranges itself into a workshop. The big tasks of the day, hauling wood, tending animals, trudging to the Lord's manor when required, are set aside. Now come the quieter labours, the ones that can be done sitting or huddled close together. A woman settles with a distaff tucked under her arm. Fibres of flax or wool wound around it. With a practiced motion, she draws a small handful of fibres out and twists them into thread, using a drop spindle that spins and bobs just above the floor. The hypnotic whirl, the steady pull of the hand, the soft hiss of fibre tightening into yarnet, all creates a kind of rhythm that fits the dark. Across medieval Europe, especially from the 12th century onward, spinning is one of the most constant forms of winter work. Cloth must be made, and spinning is the first step, producing thread for weaving in simple household looms or, in some regions, for sale to clothiers in nearby towns. Manorial records and urban regulations mention spinners again and again, often women, sometimes widows trying to support themselves. Some historians argue that this long, repetitive labour, often done in winter evenings, fed a rural textile economy far more complex than the stereotype of idle peasants would suggest. Nearby, someone else sits with a length of cloth spread over their knees, sewing patches onto a tunic. The needle is a treasured tool metal, not bone, fine enough to slip through tightly woven wool. Each stitch is small, pulled tight, meant to last because replacing the garment is not an option. A tear at the elbow becomes a new patch, cut from a sleeve that's too far gone. A frayed hem is turned and stitched again, shortening the garment but giving it another season or two of life. In some places, if you could look into legal records, you would find disputes over clothing, who owes which garments to whom, as rent or payment, a small sign that cloth is as much wealth as coin. On the floor close to the fire, a younger person scours a wooden bowl with handfuls of ash and sand, rough but effective cleansers. The inside of the bowl grows lighter, the grain of the wood standing out again. Next to them, another shapes new wooden spoons with a simple knife, shaving curls from a block of wood. These small domestic tools wear out quickly. Winter evenings are when they are replaced. You can see a line of such tasks stretching ahead. Tightening the binding on a tool handle, twisting new rope from straw or hemp, repairing a broken buckle, plaiting rushes into simple mats that will lie on the cold floor. Now and then conversation rises and falls like the firelight. Someone remarks on the weight of the snow outside. Someone else recalls a harsher winter, in the late 1200s or early 1300s, when ice-sealed rivers and storms tore at roofs. You hear mention of the bad years when grain rotted in the fields under relentless rain. Echoes of the great famine of 1315, 1317, that linger in memory and rumour long after the last starving mouths are gone. These stories travel easily on winter nights, moving from one spinning circle to another, from one village to the next. For children, winter evenings are also lessons. A small hand clumsily tries to draft wool into a thin strand, only to have it break. A patient older sibling or parent shows how to keep the tension just right. Another child is given a simple task, braiding 3 threads into a stronger cord, or tying bundles of kindling neatly. They watch how adults hold tools, how they sit close enough to the fire to see, but not so close that their clothes risk catching. Without formal schools for most, this is where skills are absorbed by repetition, by correction, by proximity. Some scholars suggest that these evenings of shared work and talk did as much to transmit culture and memory as sermons on Sundays or proclamations in the manor court. You glance at the walls and the objects hanging from them. A loom in one corner, perhaps, its warp threads waiting, bunches of dried herbs tied in small sheaves, a leather strap in need of oiling, a couple of simple iron tools that a village blacksmith has made or repaired. Winter is when such items are maintained, inventoried in the mind. If a strap breaks in the middle of ploughing season, the cost is far greater. Better to catch the weakness now, in the season of long nights, when there is time to rub in fat, to test each link, to think ahead. In some regions, especially later in the Middle Ages, rural households are drawn into wider economic networks through this evening work. A cloth merchant from a nearby town might supply wool or flax and pay villagers, often women, a small amount for spun thread, a system that foreshadows the putting out arrangements that become more common in early modern Europe. For poor peasants, this extra income is rarely enough to transform their status, but it can mean a little more grain, a paid fine, a candle bought instead of made. Historians still debate how widespread and how early such arrangements were, but most agree that winter evenings offered one of the few stretches of time when extra work for market, not just for household, could be squeezed in. As the hours pass, the fire burns lower, but the room is far from idle. Threads accumulate on the spindle, a repaired garment is folded and set aside. A newly carved spoon is tested in the simmering pot. The light shifts on faces that grow more tired but also more peaceful, the day's outdoor urgencies receding into the dark. Idle hands are rare. Even rest often involves some small, repetitive motion, twisting, braiding, smoothing, and yet, for all this busyness, there's a softness here that differs from the hard glare of summer work. The tasks are smaller, more intimate, their results held in the hand rather than measured by acres. Some scholars think that this kind of work gave peasants a degree of control, however modest, over their immediate environment. Patch by patch, stitch by stitch, they could extend the life of clothing, tools, and household goods, buffering themselves just a little against the next cold snap or the next unexpected tax. Others argue that this was simply another form of necessary labor, squeezing productivity into every usable hour. Both views catch some of the truth. Eventually, eyelids grow heavy. The spindle slows, then stills. Needles are carefully set aside so they won't be lost in the straw. Someone banks the fire, spreading ash over the coals, leaving just enough glow to find it again at dawn. The tallow candle, if one was lit, is pinched out with wetted fingers or a snuffer, releasing a last curl of acrid smoke. The room sinks back into darkness, the only light a faint reddish pulse under the ash, and perhaps a slit of cold starlight sneaking in around the shutter. You curl again into your layered bed, fingers smelling of wool fibres and smoke, ears still faintly echoing with the scrape of thread against spindle, the creak of a loom, the soft snick of a knife on wood. Outside, winter night presses close, indifferent and immense. Inside, through these long, busy evenings, poor peasants have quietly transformed a little fuel, a little time, and a lot of skill into the things that will help them face the next day's cold. When the next Sunday dawns, the light seems thinner than ever, as if the sky itself has grown tired of making an effort. Frost feathers the edge of the shutter, and your breath smokes as you pull on your cloak. Today, though, your steps are not toward the woods or the byre. They follow the sound of something else, the low, slow tolling of a bell that rolls over the frozen fields like a steady hand on your shoulder. You step outside into a world scrubbed pale. Snow, though not always constant in every winter, has come in this one, lying in uneven sheets over the rutted tracks and ridges of ploughed land. Every footprint is a dark bruise in the whiteness. The church bell sounds again, a little higher now, its note cutting through the crisp air. In many parts of medieval Europe, the parish church is the one stone building you know well, the nearest patch of masonry amid timber, thatch, and wattle. It pulls at you like a landmark in both space and time. Neighbours are already gathering along the lane, cloaks pulled tight, hoods drawn low. They move in small knots, families, servants, the elderly, leaning on sticks. Children are fussed over, faces wiped with cold, rough hands, scarves adjusted. In the distance, you can see the grey bulk of the church, its tower square and solid against the pale sky. It might have stood here since the 11th or 12th century, built when lords or monasteries endowed parishes across the countryside, tying scattered hamlets to stone, ritual, and Rome. The exact year is not clear to you, but you know it has watched many winters. The path to the church crosses fields now asleep. Where you trudged in autumn behind animals and carts, you now tread on frozen clods, the soil hard under the thin layer of snow. A narrow wooden bridge spans a stream choked with ice at the edges, water murmuring darkly under its brittle skin. Someone makes a brief sign of the cross, more habit than display. Water, even half frozen, is a thing to be both used and treated with a little awe. Above all this, the bell keeps marking the time, the call to mass ringing out over the parish. At the church door, you feel a distinct shift. The entrance is deeply set into stone, its arch decorated with simple carvings, maybe battered saints, maybe worn geometric patterns cut generations ago. You step up onto a threshold smoothed by countless feet and pass inside, into a different kind of cold. It is still chilly here, colder than your cottage when the fire is lively, but the wind is gone. Stone holds the chill, yes, but it also shields you from the biting gusts outside. The air smells of damp stone, old incense, tallow candles, and many bodies. Inside, the space opens above you in a way your cottage never does. Low beams and smoky rafters are replaced by higher roofs, perhaps with wooden vaulting or simple open trusses. Narrow windows, some stuffed with translucent horn or oiled cloth rather than glass, leak in pale light. In wealthier parishes, or in later centuries, a few coloured glass panes might show saints or simple patterns, casting faint patches of muted colour on the floor. You shuffle forward with the others, taking your place where you always do. There is no strict seating chart written down, but people fall into familiar positions, men more to one side, women to another, the better off nearer the front, the poorest hovering near the back or by the door. The stone feels cold through your thin soles. You shift your weight from foot to foot, grateful for your layers. The priest appears at the altar, his vestments bright, even in the dimness, white for Christmas, perhaps, or purple during Advent, the weeks of preparation before it. The Latin words he speaks are not ones you fully understand, but their cadence is familiar, as is the rise and fall of the responses around you. Gregorian chant, where it is used, threads through the air in smooth, unhurried lines, a contrast to the rougher songs you know from the fields and the alehouse. The calendar of the church wraps itself around winter like another blanket. You have already felt Advent, with its hints of fasting and expectation. You remember the extra lights and special food of Christmas itself, falling on the 25th of December, when even poor tables try to offer something more, perhaps a bit of better bread, a taste of meat, a shared cup of stronger ale. Now, as January crawls by, you know Candlemas is coming on the 2nd of February, when candles are blessed and carried, the light symbolically pushing back the darkness. On that day, in many places, people bring candles they have scraped and saved fat to make, hoping for protection and blessing through the rest of the winter. Standing here now, your breath mingling with others in small white puffs, you sense how this cycle turns long, confusing stretches of cold into named, structured time. Historians sometimes argue over how deeply the average peasant understood the theology behind these feasts, the fine points of doctrine decided at councils centuries ago, but most agree that the pattern itself, of holy days and fasts, gave ordinary people a framework. Days when work is forbidden or reduced, days when special foods appear or disappear, days when bells sound differently. All of these carve notches into the featureless length of winter. A lesser-known detail of this season's life flickers at the edge of your awareness. In some regions, particularly in parts of England and northern France, there is the custom of the boy bishop around St. Nicholas Day on December 6th. or the Feast of the Holy Innocents later in the month. A choir boy is briefly chosen to act as bishop in playful reversal, leading processions and giving simple blessings. You may have seen something like this, laughter and mischief threading through the chill air just outside these stone walls. Church authorities sometimes frown on such topsy-turvy moments, sometimes tolerate them. Scholars still debate whether they undermine or reinforce the hierarchy of the year. To you, it is simply another bright bead on winter's string of days. A story to remember when work feels endless. The Mass moves forward. At the elevation of the host, the priest raises the thin white wafer high, and the congregation falls to its knees, murmuring prayers in a mixture of Latin phrases and the mother tongue. You feel the hard stone under your knees, the press of bodies on either side, the shared breath of hope and fear. In years of famine or plague, these prayers must surely grow more urgent. Even in ordinary winters, they carry quiet requests for health, for enough grain to last, for animals to survive the cold, for infants not to cough themselves into the grave. Some historians argue that for many peasants, God was less a distant abstraction and more an ever-present force whose favour or anger played out immediately in the weather, the harvest, and the survival of their families. Others caution against assuming too simple a picture of medieval faith, pointing out the evidence of doubt, complaint, and even quiet skepticism in some songs and tales. When the bell rings again at the consecration, the sound is different from the one that called you here earlier, tiny, bright, almost delicate. It rings in the thick air of the nave, catching on the rough-hewn pillars, mingling with the smell of incense, if the parish can afford any on this day. Candles burn at the altar, their small flames steady in the stillness. For a moment, the stone walls, the winter, the hunger, and the smoke of your cottage all feel very far away. You stand in a space that claims to reach beyond seasons altogether. After Mass, the congregation spills out into the churchyard, and you are suddenly aware again of the cold on your face and hands. The ground is frozen around the gravestones, each one a small reminder that not everyone survives these winters. People linger anyway, stamping their feet, talking in low voices. News is exchanged. Who is ill? Whose cow has calved early? What rumours have come along the road from the nearest market town? If it is a principal feast, there may be plans for a small celebration, a parish church ale in better seasons, where drink is sold to support the building and poor relief. Even in the bare months, charity from the parish bread or alms distributed on certain days can mean the difference between hunger and starvation for the very poorest. You walk home more slowly, warmed in a way that has little to do with embers or cloaks. The church's stone walls have not given you heat in the way your hearth does, but they have enclosed you for a while in something structured. Bells, words, gestures, a story about the world in which winter and suffering are part of a larger arc. Whether you accept every detail of that story or simply cling to the repetition of it, it helps to make the cold months feel less random. The path you tread, snow, bridge, lane, door, is the same one you walked out by, but your steps fall into the rhythm of the bell that still seems to echo faintly in your ears. Back in the cottage, the fire is coaxed up again, and the familiar smells of smoke and pottage wrap around you. You take off your cloak and hang it to dry, your cheeks still pink from the air, and, perhaps, from song and incense. Outside, winter remains just as sharp. Inside, you carry with you the sound of bells and the enfolding dimness of stone, the sense that in a season when so much is out of your control, there is at least one place where time is counted, prayers are said, and candles are lit against the dark. The next night, you notice it before you are fully awake, the ragged edge to someone's breathing in the dark. At first, you think it's just the usual clearing of smoke from a throat, the little coughs that follow a day breathing air thick with hearth fumes. But then it comes again, deeper, longer, ending in a wet little gasp that makes everyone on the pallet shift slightly, as if they can move away from the sound without actually leaving. The fire has burned low, banked under ash, and the room feels colder than usual at its edges. Somewhere near the wall, a child coughs again and again, the sound scraping at the quiet. In a one-room cottage like this, there is no possibility of keeping your distance. The same smoke-dark rafters shelter the sick and the well alike. In winter, when windows stay shut and doors are opened only briefly, air lingers. Warmth and breath, comfort and contagion, mix in the same narrow space. You sit up, the blankets falling from your shoulders, and the cold immediately bites at your skin. Someone else is already moving, a mother, perhaps, or an older sister feeling along the pallet to find the small, hot shape of the coughing child. In the dim glow from the hearth's buried embers, you see the shine of sweat on a forehead, the flushed cheeks above a chapped, cracked mouth. Fever here is not an abstract number on a thermometer. It is heat radiating into the chilly air, a touch that feels wrong. Illness is no stranger to medieval winters. Across Europe, from roughly the 12th to the 15th centuries, parish records and later demographic studies show that deaths often rise in the colder months. Respiratory infections take hold in crowded, smoky houses. Weakened bodies, already trimming calories to stretch grain, cannot fight as easily. Some years bring particular horrors: plague years, in the later 14th century, especially when the Black Death sweeps through between about 1347 and 1352, and again in later waves. But even in years without great epidemics, there is a steady background of coughs, fevers, infections, and injuries that never heal quite right. Historians still debate whether medieval peasants were constantly on the edge of collapse or more resilient than we think, but most agree that the margin for error, one illness too many, one cold snap too long, was frighteningly thin. A pot is fetched closer to the hearth. Someone carefully brushes back the ash and coaxes the embers into a small flame, adding just enough kindling to bring the water in the pot to a steam. There are herbs hanging from the rafters, sage, maybe, or thyme, gathered in warmer months from garden plots or hedgerows. In many rural households, such herbs are the first line of defense against winter sickness. A handful is crumbled into the water. The steam begins to carry a sharper green scent, cutting through the thick smoke. A cloth is dipped, wrung out, and pressed to the child's forehead. Another rag may be soaked and laid on the chest, the warmth seeping slowly in. Honey, if any remains from the hives kept near the edge of the village, might be stirred into warm water or weak ale and offered in small sips to soothe the throat. Garlic and onions, strong-smelling and sturdy in storage, are sometimes chopped and added to pottage or used in simple home remedies. These are not miracles, but they are what poor people have, plants with noticeable effects, passed down through memory and practice. There is talk, too, of humours and balances, phrases that echo ideas taught in the few medical texts that filter down from monasteries and universities. Even if no one in this cottage has ever met a learned physician, the framework of hot and cold, moist and dry, has seeped into common speech. A wet, cold winter is bad for the body. A phlegmatic cough suggests an excess of one humour. Certain foods or herbs are said to warm or dry the body internally. In richer households, a physician might prescribe bleeding or purging to restore balance, sometimes with leeches or carefully measured incisions. In this cottage, there may be no access to such formal treatments, but the idea that illness is a matter of imbalance, that the body must be nudged back into harmony, shapes which herbs are chosen, which foods are given or withheld. Someone mutters about bad air, the miasma that many in this period believe carries disease. The smell of the byre, the thick smoke near the rafters, the chill draft that slides under the door all become suspect. A shutter is cracked just a little to change the air, even though it lets in more cold. A bundle of herbs might be burned gently near the hearth, their smoke thought to cleanse what cannot be seen. Modern scholars might point to bacteria, viruses, and cramped living conditions, but they also note that medieval people were not ignorant of patterns. They noticed that sickness spread in close quarters, that certain smells and conditions seemed linked to disease, and they acted according to the best explanations available to them. You hear someone quietly suggest calling on a particular saint. Street, Blaze, remembered as a protector of throats, might be invoked when coughing will not stop. Street, Roch, in plague years, is begged for mercy. Street Anthony is connected with a burning skin disease that flares when people eat rye contaminated with ergot fungus, a condition later called Street Anthony's fire. The parish priest might have a blessing or a relic. A neighbour might know a charm, bits of bone, fragments of cloth. A small cross carved from applewood. These are pressed into small hands, hung around necks, tucked under pillows. To you, they may look like superstition. To the people here, they are another layer of protection, woven together with herbs and prayers. The night stretches, the child's coughing comes in bouts, then quiets, then returns. Others in the house lie awake, listening. They are thinking not only of this one illness, but of all the others they have seen. Siblings lost in infancy, neighbours taken by sudden fevers, a cousin who never recovered from a winter chill that turned to something deeper in the lungs. They remember the great sickness years ago, when bodies were carried through these very lanes to the churchyard in numbers. No one could count ashes of memory from the Black Death or later outbreaks that still glow in stories told by firelight. When historians read wills and burial registers, they see numbers. You hear the echo of those years in the way people fall silent at certain names. In the middle of the night, someone rises to heat stones in the hearth ashes, wrapping them in cloth and placing them at the child's feet and sides. A small, portable store of warmth. It is a simple trick, used wherever stones and fires coexist, and it makes sense. Warmth applied to extremities, warmth held close to the core, warmth that does not depend entirely on the fluctuating fire. In some places, bricks or earthenware pots serve the same purpose, filled with embers and carefully handled. These are the hot water bottles of an age before rubber and kettles. For all this care, there is an awareness that outcomes are uncertain. If the child lives, it will be because the body was strong enough, the herbs helpful enough, the air not too foul, the winter not too harsh, or, as many here would say, because God willed it. If the child dies, the explanations will follow the same pattern, but with darker weights. Sin, misfortune, witchcraft whispered in some corners, or simply it was their time. Modern historians argue about how fatalistic medieval peasants really were, whether they truly accepted suffering as inevitable or raged against it in their own quiet ways. The surviving sources give hints of both resignation and resistance. Toward dawn, the coughing eases. The child sleeps, though their breath is still uneven. Around them, the rest of the household dozes in fits and starts, never fully relaxed but too exhausted to stay alert. The fire under its ash blanket glows faintly, the only steady heartbeat in the room. Outside, frost has crept higher on the door and along the shutter edges. Inside, anxiety and care have forged a different kind of heat, one made of touch, attention, and determination. When the pale light finally seeps in, someone will check the fever again, brew more herbs, maybe walk to the church to light a candle. If the sick one recovers, life will fold back around them, chores waiting, fields and animals needing hands. If they weaken, the house will rearrange itself once more, this time around grief. In either case, the will to see spring remains stubborn. Winter may strip away comfort and certainty, but it cannot quite extinguish that quiet, persistent hope you feel every time someone gets up in the cold to stir the fire, mix a bitter draught, or lay a warm hand on a sweating forehead. Morning comes grey and heavy, the kind of light that feels tired before the day even begins. In the cottage, people move quietly, checking on the sick child, stirring the embers, pulling on stiff, chilled clothes. The cold still sits in your bones, but today there is another weight pressing on your shoulders. The knowledge that you must leave the fragile warmth of this room and walk out across frozen tracks, not for wood or water, but to stand in front of power. Word has come from the reeve or the bailiff, the lord's official in the village. Tenants are to present themselves at the manor today. Perhaps it is around Martinmas, in early November, when many rents are traditionally due. Perhaps Candlemas approaches, that February point in the year when certain payments or services are reckoned. The exact feast can shift from place to place, but the pattern holds. Even when the fields sleep under frost, obligations do not. You step outside, cloak pulled close, hood low over your brow. The path to the manor is already marked by footprints, and the grooves of cartwheels frozen hard in the ground. Snow lies in thin, wind-combed drifts along the hedges, leaving the raised track exposed like a scar. Around you, other villagers walk the same way. Some carry small sacks, others lead pigs or chickens on ropes. Others simply walk with hands hidden inside their sleeves, heavy with the knowledge of coins in their fists, or the lack of them. In the distance, the manor house rises above the village. It is not always the grand castle of stories. More often, it is a substantial hall of timber or stone, with outbuildings and barns clustered around it. On some great estates like those of the Bishop of Winchester, in southern England, carefully recorded in manorial rolls, there are multiple halls and granges managing wide demesne lands. On smaller manors, the lord's house is modest but still imposing compared to your cottage. Higher walls, more glass in the windows if he is wealthy, larger chimneys sending up thicker threads of smoke. You pass through a gate, or between stone gateposts, into the manor yard. Here, winter looks a little different. Stacks of hay and straw rise high, carefully thatched against snow. The lord's own animals crowd in larger byres or barns. A servant, better clothed than you, crosses the yard with a bucket that steams in the cold. Men-at-arms or household servants, cloaks trimmed with fur, glance at the gathering tenants with practiced disinterest. You are reminded, without words, of your place. In the great barn, threshing continues even in winter. You hear the dull, rhythmic thud of flails as hired labourers or tenants on boon work beat sheaves of grain laid out on the earthen floor. Straw and chaff leap in small clouds, catching the thin light that filters through slits high in the walls. Winter may pause the ploughs, but the lord's grain must still be processed, measured, and sent to market or to his own table. On some manors, custumals, the written lists of obligations, spell out that certain tenants owe days of winter threshing or the carting of grain and wood, services as binding as any rent. You're guided or herded toward the manor hall or another large room where payments will be made. Inside, the air is warmer than outside, thanks to a bigger hearth and better fuel. Rushes, or straw on the floor, have been strewn with sweet-smelling herbs, or simply replaced more often than in your cottage. A long table stands at one end, behind which sit the steward or bailiff and the reeve, perhaps with the lord himself, if he is in residence. Before them lies a chest, a tally stick, maybe a parchment roll. Names are called. Some tenants step forward and lay down coins, silver pennies, clipped and worn, stamped with the profile of the current king, or one from a reign past. Others produce in-kind payments, measured amounts of grain, a side of bacon, a goose for Christmas, a clutch of hens. You see one man bring a bundle of spun wool. His rent has been commuted to a fixed amount of textile each year. Another owes days of labour rather than goods. His presence recorded for service on the Lord's demesne fields when spring returns. The variety is dizzying, but behind it lies a clear logic. The land you work is not truly yours. In exchange for using it, you owe. Sometimes the obligations are surprisingly specific. A tenant might owe the duty of carting a set number of loads of firewood from the Lord's woodland to the manor yard each winter, or of repairing a stretch of hedge around the demesne pasture, or of providing a man with horse and cart to carry grain to a distant market on certain days. Scholars poring over manorial records find these details in cramped Latin script. He shall carry wood. She shall provide one hen at Christmas. They shall reap with one man for so many days. To you, they are not lines on parchment. They are hours of your life marked out in the snow. When your name is called, you move forward, feeling the eyes on your back. If your rent is partly in grain, you may have already delivered sacks to the manor barn. Today you confirm the amount. If coin is required, you open your hand and place the cold metal on the table. The steward counts carefully, possibly notching a tally stick to match the entry in the roll. A mistake here, on their side or yours, can echo later in fines or disputes. You are polite, even deferential, but you watch closely. In this room, Math matters more than good intentions. If you are a villain, bound to the land, your obligations include not just rents, but labor services, those week works and boon works, when you must put aside your own tasks to work the Lord's land. In the early medieval centuries, and in some regions later, these services can be heavy. Several days a week during peak seasons, plus extra at harvest. Over time, in many parts of Western Europe, especially by the 13th and 14th centuries, these labor obligations are increasingly commuted into money rents. You might prefer this arrangement. Coins feel more flexible than the demand that your body appear, hoe in hand, at dawn. Historians still argue over how burdensome these obligations truly were, whether serfdom was a crushing, inescapable bondage, or a more negotiated, flexible system with room for peasant agency. The truth, as you feel it in your feet on this frozen floor, likely lies somewhere between, a framework of power shot through with small bargains. Not all who stand here are unfree. Free peasants, holding land by charter, owe rents but not labor. Cottars, with only a tiny plot, owe less, but also have less to fall back on when winter bites. A widow may stand with a child at her side, negotiating how her late husband's duties will be divided. A younger son, recently married, might plead for a little land to be granted, or leased, so he can support his new household. The manor court, which sometimes meets on days like this, hears small disputes alongside these obligations. Quarrels over boundaries, accusations of unpaid dues, fines for taking wood from the Lord's forest without leave. Outside the hall, you can see evidence of the Lord's winter expectations stamped into the landscape. A group of men is repairing a broken bridge plank on the road leading to the manor, fulfilling their obligation to maintain the infrastructure that primarily serves the Lord's traffic. Others trim and lay hedge along the Demenza field, weaving thorny branches to keep animals where the Lord wants them. These are not spontaneous acts of community care. They are required, and failing to perform them can mean fines or worse. And yet, as you watch the steward take note of each payment, you know that the relationship is not entirely one way. In times of extreme crisis during harvest failure, for example, lords sometimes remit part of a rent, offer grain from their own stores, or grant access to woodland or pasture that would otherwise be restricted. Such acts can be genuinely helpful, and they also reinforce authority. The same hand that takes can give. Some historians describe this as a seigneurial compact, a rough, unequal bargain in which protection and access to land are exchanged for rents and service. Others emphasize how often the scales tip toward exploitation, with lords squeezing more in taxes, fees, and arbitrary fines. Both perspectives find support in the records. Your own view depends heavily on whether this particular lord leans more toward harshness or pragmatism this winter. When your business is done, you step back, the small space in front of the table filled by the next tenant. Outside, the air hits your face with renewed sharpness. You feel lighter. In one way, obligation for this particular day has been met, but also more vulnerable. The grain given, the coins surrendered, the pledge of future labor. All of these reduce your margin for survival just a little. You hope, silently, that the Lord's promises hold if the winter worsens, that the manor's barn will not stand full while your pot empties. The walk home is quieter. People talk in low voices about what was demanded, what was forgiven, who incurred fines. A neighbor mutters about an unjust measure. Another shrugs and says it has always been like this. In some parts of Europe, especially in later centuries, such murmurs will grow into open revolt, like the English peasants' revolt of 1381, or uprisings in Flanders and France, sparked by anger at taxes, labor demands, and harsh lords. In this moment, though, the snow muffles everything. Grievances are wrapped and rewrapped like cloaks. There is wood to gather, animals to tend, a sick child to check on. Back in the cottage, the space seems smaller, but also more yours, for all its drafty walls. The fire is coaxed up, pottage stirred, blankets shaken out. Outside, atop the hill, or at the edge of the fields, The manor stands solid against the winter sky, its rights newly confirmed by the coins and goods laid on its tables. Inside your low house, you hold on to the more fragile things, the warmth of bodies, the small comfort of food, the stubborn knowledge that, obligations or not, you will do what you can to carry your household to spring. The days keep grinding on, each one a little like the last, feeding the fire, tending animals, checking the sick, worrying over rents, and yet, as the winter deepens, you start to feel a faint change in the air that has nothing to do with the wind. It comes in scraps of song hummed while spinning, in the way people talk about certain dates, in the way a neighbor mentions, almost casually, that she's saving a little flour for Christmas. Even in this hard world, the calendar keeps a few bright threads, and now you are approaching one of the brightest. In December, the darkness grows almost luxurious in its depth. Nights begin mid-afternoon. Mornings hesitate. Work still has to be done. But you notice that conversation turns more often to the church, to saints' days, to the coming of Christ's Mass on the 25th of the month. Advent, the 4 weeks leading up to it, is supposed to be a season of fasting and reflection, a kind of spiritual winter before the feasting. For poor peasants, fasting can blur uncomfortably with simple shortage. Yet the idea that after this narrowing time comes celebration gives a different flavour to the hunger. On Christmas Eve, the cottage is as cold and smoky as ever, but the smell inside is different. The pottage in the pot is richer, thick with whatever has been saved for this day. Perhaps dried peas, the last of the autumn cabbages, a bit more oil or fat than usual. If your household slaughtered a pig at Martinmas, salted scraps of pork may be brought out now, carefully rinsed of excess salt and added to the stew. A crust of better bread, whiter if you're fortunate enough to have wheat, or at least made from cleaner, better ground grain, is brought from its cloth. Perhaps there is a little cheese, a few dried apples or pears. The portions are still not lavish, but they are noticeably more generous than on a regular day. In some households, a particularly cherished piece of meat, a small roast, maybe, or a joint of mutton if a sheep had to be culled, is cooked on the hearth, the rare smell of roasting fat turning the air thick and almost dizzying. You're aware that up at the manor, the Lord's Hall is likely hosting a far grander feast. Boar's head or venison, spiced wine, minstrels, and many candles. Chronicles and household accounts sometimes list those dishes in mouth-watering detail, but even knowing that, you cling to what appears here on your own table, understanding that this is one of the few days when the relentless calculus of rationing steps aside, just a little, to make room for joy. After the meal, there may be singing. The carols you know are not yet the polished Victorian tunes that will echo in later centuries, but simpler, more rustic songs, some in Latin refrains learned from the church, others in your own tongue, passing from mouth to mouth without ever being written down. They weave together bits of the nativity story with local images. Christ born in a stable, yes, but also imagined as close to your own barn, your own animals, your own winter fields. Historians who study medieval carols note how often they blend high theology with country detail. You feel that blend as you sing of stars over Bethlehem while hearing the wind push at your own shutters. For 12 days after Christmas, through to Epiphany on January 6th, the church's official festive season continues, and with it, a loosening of some of winter's strictness. Work does not halt entirely for peasants, but certain days are set apart. On St. Stephen's Day, December 26th, some places follow customs of almsgiving. In others, servants or poorer folk go from house to house, receiving small gifts. On New Year's, modest presents might pass between lord and tenant, perhaps a token coin from the manor in exchange for a small gift, reinforcing bonds of patronage. In some regions, people engage in wassailing, lifting a shared bowl of spiced drink, sometimes in orchards among the fruit trees, sometimes in halls or cottages, to toast health and future abundance. The exact forms fluctuate from region to region, and historians debate how early certain practices appear. But the idea, A midwinter moment of noisy blessing and hope is widespread. In the village streets, such as they are, you might see mummers, groups of young men dressed in odd, cobbled-together costumes, faces partly masked or blackened, going from house to house to perform rough little plays. These performances, often involving stock characters, a fool, a king, a doctor, mix comic fights, mock deaths, and miraculous revivals. A hat is passed afterward for coins or food. Church authorities and sober clerics sometimes complain about such revelry, especially when it becomes boisterous or blurs into misrule. Yet the plays persist, shape-shifting from century to century, giving people a chance to laugh at the very things that frighten them: death, authority, illness, while snow crunches under their shoes. In and around churches, you may witness other, more official inversions. The Feast of Fools, observed in some places around New Year, sees lower clergy parody higher officials, with silly processions and satirical songs. The custom of the boy bishop, which you have heard of before, appears again. A choir boy dresses in mitre and cope, leading short processions, blessing people in a game that is both play and serious ritual. Church councils over the centuries repeatedly try to curb or tame these practices. Some dioceses ban them outright. Historians still argue whether such brief role reversals truly challenged the social order or ultimately reinforced it by making the normal hierarchy feel more acceptable after the joke ended. To you, they feel like brief, necessary exhalations in a season that otherwise keeps everyone's head bent low. Within the cottage, physical signs of the season linger: evergreens, holly, ivy, perhaps sprigs of fir or box, are brought indoors and hung over beams, on doors, around the single precious icon or crucifix on the wall. In northern climates, this use of evergreens at midwinter has deep roots. They stand for life that persists when fields and hedges look dead. The church overlays this with its own symbolism, accepting some forms, discouraging others. But in your house, the meaning is simple. Green, in the dark months, feels like a promise. Not every festival is triumphant. After Christmas and Epiphany, the year moves toward Candlemas, and then toward Lent, that long season of fasting before Easter. In some regions, especially by the later Middle Ages, the days just before Lent, what will later be called Carnival, in many places, become another time of excess and role reversal. Pancakes fried to use up fat, masks, and games, occasionally rough antics that spill into trouble. For now, in your rural life, the rituals are simpler: a richer meal before the lean weeks, some jokes, perhaps a small village custom involving bonfires or processions, all aimed at squeezing a little brightness out of the waning winter. For young people, these festivals also offer rare chances to look beyond work and obligation. A dance in the churchyard after Mass, even in winter, a shared cup of ale at a parish gathering, a mumming troupe that needs extra players. These are moments when glances are exchanged, songs are learned, reputations formed. Marriage negotiations might begin with a conversation at a Christmas ale or a shared laugh during a New Year's custom. Peasant life is not only toil and fear. These patterned intervals of permitted fun give people a chance to be seen in a different light, even if only for an evening. You might think that such celebrations would be rare in times of crisis, but the records suggest otherwise. Chronicles from years of famine and plague often mention that people clung even more tightly to feast days, sometimes intensifying processions, prayers, and rituals when hardship sharpened fear. Some scholars argue that festivals were a form of resilience, a way for communities to assert continuity when weather, disease, and lords all conspired to make the world feel unstable. Others caution that church and secular authorities also used festive gatherings to display power, public pardons, announcements, and displays of generosity that bound people more tightly to those above them. As you stand in a frozen churchyard watching a small bonfire flare on a saint's day, you may sense both impulses at once: genuine joy from below, calculated magnanimity from above. Eventually, the 12 days end. Candles from Candlemas are blessed and taken home, to be lit against storms or sickness. The evergreens dry and drop their leaves, swept out with the rushes. Ordinary days return the same smoky hearth, the same thin pottage, the same obligations. Yet something in you has been slightly refilled. The songs still hum under your breath as you card wool. The memory of a fuller bowl, a shared joke, or a candlelit procession lingers like warmth in the hands after a fire. Outside, the snow has not vanished. The cold does not care about feast days. But for a brief span, you and your neighbours have pushed back against its indifference with sound and light bells, songs, masks, greenery, special foods scraped from the back of the chest. Winter will keep pressing for weeks, yet perhaps months. Even so, you carry forward those small, bright islands of celebration, stepping from one to the next across the long, icy river of the season. Night comes down thick and early now, the kind of dark that seems to have texture, like a heavy cloth laid over the fields and hedges. Inside the cottage, the last chores have been folded away for the day. The spinning has stopped, the mending is put aside. The animals on the other side of the wall have settled into their breathing chorus. The fire has been allowed to sink into a soft bed of embers, enough for a little light, but not so much as to waste precious fuel. You lie there, not quite ready to sleep, listening to the familiar creaks and sighs of the house. In that in-between time, after work, but before true rest, something else begins to fill the air. Someone clears their throat, shifts a little closer to the hearth, and starts to talk. It's not a formal announcement. It's more like the way you'd ease into a song. A story begins, and with it, the night becomes a different sort of landscape. It might start with a saint. Across the Christian centuries of medieval Europe, tales from collections like the Golden Legend, compiled in the 13th century, spread far beyond monasteries and town pulpits into cottages like this. You may not know the book's name, but you know its stories, of St. Nicholas secretly leaving gifts and saving the poor from ruin, of St. Martin cutting his cloak in two to share it with a freezing beggar at the city gate, of St. Blaise healing a child choking on a fishbone. Each tale offers a small, bright image of mercy or protection, and on a night when cold presses at the door, the idea that holy figures walk unseen through the winter world is a comforting one. The storyteller's voice is slow, almost drowsy, but the images are clear. You imagine St. Martin, his cloak billowing against the wind, slicing it for the shivering man. You glance involuntarily at your own patched cloak hanging on its peg. It is thin, frayed, barely enough for you. The idea of giving half away pulls at your sense of rightness and your fear of the cold at the same time. Some historians think these stories worked as moral nudges in a world where charity could be a matter of life and death. Others point out that they also reassured the poor that God noticed their plight, even if human lords did not. The saints' tales are only one layer of the night's storytelling. Once those are done, perhaps after a murmured prayer or two, another kind of story creeps in, one that feels older, less tidy. Someone mentions lights seen over the marsh last week, flickering where no hearth stands. Will-o'-the-wisps, some say, trickster spirits that lead the unwary into bogs. Others insist they are souls in need of prayer, or simply foul gases from the ground. The explanations slip and overlap. In the dim glow of the embers, the line between what the priest says on Sunday and what elders whisper on Tuesday night is soft. You hear about the forest at the edge of the manor, the deep section of trees where even woodcutters dislike going alone. Wolves hunt there in winters when game is scarce, their howls threading under the wind. The storyteller raises a hand, fingers casting a moving shadow on the wall, and speaks of hunters who vanished in those woods at Christmastide, only to be seen years later riding in a ghostly procession through the night sky, a version of what later scholars call the wild hunt. The church officially frowns on talk of wandering spirits or night-riding hosts, and texts like the Canon Episcopi from earlier centuries warn against believing that people physically fly with such bands. But such warnings sit side by side with the tales, not always erasing them. People nod, crossing themselves, not quite sure where admonition ends and experience begins. Closer to home, you hear of revenants, restless dead said to rise from their graves. Chroniclers like William of Newburgh in 12th century England tell of corpses that leave churchyards at night to trouble the living until proper rituals are done. Your village's stories may not be written in Latin, but they echo the same themes. A man who died owing a debt and now is heard thumping at doors. A woman who cursed her neighbours and whose shadow supposedly walks the lane after dark. Whether or not anyone truly believes that bones claw up through frozen soil, everyone makes a point of blessing themselves when they pass the churchyard alone, just in case. Charms weave themselves into this nighttime fabric as naturally as smoke. A mother checks that a small cross, scratched with a knife into the wood above the door, is still clearly visible. A sprig of rowan or another protective plant hangs near a child's cradle, tied there months ago when the leaves were still green, now dried but still potent in the household imagination. A small scrap of wax from a candle blessed at Candlemas might be tucked into a pouch and hung on a thong around someone's neck, especially if they are prone to sickness. To you, these look like little talismans. To those who live here, they are another layer in the armor against everything winter brings: cold, hunger, illness, things seen and unseen. Some stories turn darker around the edges when they brush against the idea of malice closer to home. Witches, in the modern sense of people secretly consorting with the devil, have not yet become the central focus of huge persecutions in most of the medieval centuries. That grim phenomenon will swell later, in early modern Europe, but suspicion of harmful magic, of curses and charms gone bad, is already part of village life. If a cow sickens unexpectedly, if butter refuses to churn, if a child wastes away, tongues may wag. Perhaps someone remembers a quarrel with the woman who lives alone at the far edge of the settlement. Perhaps they murmur that she has the evil eye. Church courts and theologians argue about how much power such people truly have and what is mere illusion. But in the cottage, on a windy night, it is the story that lingers, not the theological nuance. Yet even as fear curls through some of these tales, there is also a strong current of reassurance. The storyteller leans closer to the fire, voice dropping, and then reminds everyone that the sign of the cross dispels shadows, that a candle blessed at the altar burns brighter than any wandering light, that ringing the church bell in a storm can drive away demons. You remember how the priest has said that many of the frightening visions people claim, night rides, midnight dances with spirits, are deceptions of the devil or of human imagination. Historians still argue about how literally medieval people took such warnings, and how much they used them as a language for experiences they couldn't otherwise explain. Nightmares, sleep paralysis, the way a house can creak like footsteps when the wind hits it just so. Children edge closer to adults as the stories grow a little more frightening, small bodies pressing into larger ones. The rhythm of the voice, the crackle of the fire, the faint animal smells from the byre, all of it blends into a cocoon that makes the tales both immersive and oddly safe. You begin to realize that telling of danger is itself a way of managing it. If you can name the thing that frightens you, wolf, spirit, sickness, hunger, you can also list the things that hold it at bay: saints, charms, prayers, neighbors, habits. Some scholars see in this storytelling a kind of communal psychology, a nightly group therapy session before the concept had a name. Others caution that it also reinforces fear and suspicion, especially when stories point fingers at specific people. Both interpretations feel possible as you listen, the embers painting everyone's faces in slow pulses of light and shadow. Outside, the wind changes direction, whistling differently around the thatched roof. For a moment, a branch scratches against the wall, sounding exactly like fingernails. A few people start, then laugh softly, as the storyteller incorporates the noise into the tale. There, you hear them, the spirits scratching, wanting to come in but they can't, because we have the cross over the door and good St. Nicholas watching the roof. Laughter loosens the tension. A child repeats the line in a whisper, half afraid, half delighted. Eventually, the stories soften. The fierce hunts fade into accounts of miracles at local shrines, someone's uncle who swears his leg healed after walking, in pain, to a chapel miles away, a neighbor who puts her faith in a particular saint's image and claims her fever broke. The house relaxes with the narration, drifting from fear to comfort like a tide. The last tale may be a simple one. How, when your grandparents were young, the winter of a certain year froze the river solid enough that carts crossed on the ice. But spring came in the end, and with it, flowers even brighter for the delay. When the last voice trails off, the silence feels kinder than the earlier quiet. The embers on the hearth glow low, their light softer, more diffused. People shift into their sleeping places, pulling blankets up, muttering a last prayer, maybe touching a charm, or making the sign of the cross in the air. The fears named in the stories do not vanish. You can still imagine wolves in the forest, spirits in the lanes, sickness in the lungs, but they are now woven into a pattern that includes saints, charms, jokes, and the simple fact that generations before you have heard the same tales and still manage to wake up when the pale light returns. You close your eyes, the echo of the stories humming faintly in your mind. Outside, the night is vast and cold and indifferent. Inside, words, beliefs, and small rituals have turned it into something a little more manageable. A tapestry of saints and spirits, dangers and protections, fears and comforts, all stitched together by voices around a slowly cooling fire. One morning, long after you've stopped expecting it, the light feels different on your face. At first, you think you've imagined it just another grey dawn, like all the others. But when you push back the blanket and sit up, the air that seeps in around the shutter has lost a little of its bite. It is still cold, still sharp enough to sting your nose, yet beneath it there is a softness, a hint of something that is not quite warmth, but is no longer pure, hard frost either. Someone opens the door, just a crack, and instead of the dry squeak of frozen hinges, you hear a damp creak. A breath of air comes in, and it smells wet, not the icy dryness of deep winter, but the heavier scent of thawing earth. You step outside and see that the familiar glitter on the ground has dulled. Snow, where it remains, is pitted and grey, shrinking back from the ruts and ridges it had covered so completely only weeks ago. In the yard, where frost once traced delicate white patterns on every surface, small beads of water now hang from thatch and bare twigs, trembling before they fall. This is the uneasy season between winter and spring, the time some people later call the Hungry Gap. In much of medieval Europe, especially in the north and west, it tends to fall around late February and March. Candlemas on the 2nd of February has come and gone, its blessed candles tucked away in chests and on beams, ready to be lit against storms. Ash Wednesday may already have marked the start of Lent, that long stretch of fasting before Easter. Days are a little longer now. The sun lingers in the sky, as if reluctant to sink, but the stored food in chests and bins has also thinned. Historians note that this time could be as anxious as the heart of winter, sometimes more so. The worst cold is easing, but the next harvest is still months away. You walk along the lane and feel the ground changing under your feet. Where frost once made the earth firm, now the surface has turned to mud. Each step makes a soft, sucking sound. The track holds your footprints greedily. Meltwater trickles in thin streams along the edges of fields, pooling in low spots, reflecting the washed-out sky. If the winter has been particularly snowy, or the thaw sudden, rivers swell, spilling over their banks into meadows. Bridges must be checked. The little wooden one you cross on the way to church or manor has swollen joints and a new lean to its railing. Men will be sent to shore it up, plugging gaps with fresh timbers before carts must pass with seed and manure. In the village, roofs that have shouldered snow for months now drip steadily. Thatched eaves shed little cascades of water. Where the thatch is worn thin, leaks appear inside, darkening the packed earth floor. This is the moment when the repairs you planned by the winter hearth must become action. Bundles of new thatch, gathered and tied in late summer, are brought out. People climb ladders that wobble in the soft earth, cutting away rotten sections, tying in fresh reeds or straw. For a little while, the cottage feels more vulnerable than ever. Patches of sky visible through the roof, the smell of wet thatch and smoke mingling in odd ways. Yet each new bundle tied down is a small victory against next year's storms. Beyond the houses, the fields call, not with green yet, but with a kind of potential. In regions with a three-field system, one set of strips has spent the winter holding the lords' and peasants' winter crops, wheat or rye, sown back in the autumn, now just beginning to show faint, ragged lines of green when the snow recedes. Another set of fields lies fallow or under stubble, waiting for the plough. The third is reserved for spring-sown grains like barley or oats, or for legumes, peas, beans, vetch that will help restore the soil. You stand at the edge of these open fields, the long, narrow strips of land laid out like a rough patchwork quilt, and imagine how soon they will fill with movement again. First, though, the ground must dry enough to bear weight. Oxen cannot pull a heavy plough through waterlogged soil without exhausting themselves or tearing the field into useless ruts. So people wait and test. A man digs his heel into a strip, lifts a clod, crumbles it in his hand. Too sticky. Another day or two, perhaps longer. A woman looks anxiously at the sky, judging whether more rain or a late frost is on the way. You can almost hear the unspoken equations. If the ploughing starts by such and such a saint's day, there will be time to sow before Easter. If not, the harvest may be late and the next winter leaner. Meanwhile, you turn to the jobs that can be done right away. Fences and hedges, strained by snow and browsing animals, must be repaired. In places with living hedges, people cut and lay stems, training them horizontal and weaving them together to make a dense barrier. Thorn bushes are interlaced, their sharp points turned outward to discourage cattle and sheep from pushing through. These hedges will help keep animals out of the growing crops and in the common pastures as spring advances. The work is slow, prickly, and sometimes painful. Hands and arms carry scratches for days, but it is necessary. Tools, too, come under scrutiny. Those ploughshares you inspected by dim firelight in January must now be really tested. Iron points are hammered and sharpened at the smithy. Wooden beams and handles are checked for rot, tightened where joints have loosened in the damp. In many villages, the communal nature of the open field system means cooperation is built into this moment. Strips belonging to different households lie side by side. Paths, furrows, and timings must be coordinated. On some days, several teams of oxen will move down adjacent strips in a rough line, neighbors walking and shouting encouragement. The smell of earth and animal mingling in the chilly air. You notice that the animals themselves look different now. Their winter coats are beginning to loosen. Tufts of hair cling to fences and gateposts where they have rubbed themselves. Cows who spent the hardest part of the cold in cramped byres step cautiously into the churned, damp yards, hooves hesitating on the slippery ground. Sheep lifted from cramped winter folds shake themselves, sending little showers of dirt and dried droppings into the air. Their ribs may show a little more plainly than they did in autumn. Fodder has been carefully rationed, and every wisp of hay was counted. Soon, if grass begins to grow, their diet will improve, but the next few weeks are a narrow bridge they must also cross. Inside the house, the change of season means sorting and reckoning. Grain bins are checked and rechecked. The amount left is compared, mentally or aloud, with the likely date when new crops, early greens, perhaps, or fresh milk from animals whose calving season is beginning, will start to trickle into the diet. In some years, the calculations are comfortable enough. In others, you can feel the tension prickling in the air as people speak of thinning porridge a little more, of stretching bread by adding more bran. Historians differ on how often medieval peasants truly faced the brink of starvation in ordinary years, but many agree that this late winter moment, before the first fresh foods and after months of drawing down stores, was a time of particular vulnerability. Yet even here, with anxiety murmuring in the background, there is a lift in spirits that you cannot ignore. The days are visibly longer. When you come back from the fields or from mending fences, it is no longer pitch black in the mid-afternoon. Birds have changed their songs. Even in bare hedges, you hear new, tentative notes that were absent in December's muffled silence. A thin haze of green starts to creep over certain sheltered slopes where grass feels braver. Children, who have spent much of winter indoors or in tight, cold yards, run farther now, splashing in puddles, returning with wet hems and flushed faces. On some feast days, the church acknowledges this shift too. Rogation processions, which in many regions occur later in spring, have their roots in this sense of a world waking up. People walk the boundaries of fields, chanting litanies to bless the crops and ward off blight and storm. Even before the formal processions, though, you may hear the priests speak in sermons about sowing, about the seed parables in the Gospels, linking your looming toil to sacred stories. Scholars debate how much such rituals and teachings reassured or controlled peasants. But you, with mud on your shoes and the smell of damp earth in your nostrils, mostly hear in them a recognition that what happens in these next weeks truly matters. One evening, as you return from checking a field's readiness, you pause at the cottage door where, months ago, you first traced the line of frost with your fingers. Now, instead of a white crust, there is only a wet line where melted snow has dripped and dried. The door is still crooked, the walls still lean, the patchwork blankets inside are still thin, but the air that slips under the threshold no longer feels like an enemy so much as a messenger, carrying the faintest scent of things growing somewhere unseen. Historians sometimes argue about how medieval peasants experienced time, whether they lived wholly in a cycle of repeating seasons, or also felt, as we do, the sense of years marching forward, each one a little different from the last. Standing here, you can feel both at once. This thaw has come many times before, and will, you hope, come many times again. Yet this particular winter, with its specific fears, its sick child, its exact measure of wood and grain, is beginning to loosen its grip. What remains now is the work of turning this softening earth, this lengthening light, into the next year's survival. You step inside, brush damp mud from your shoes, and warm your hands over the rekindled hearth. Outside, puddles slowly mirror a sky that stays bright just a heartbeat longer each day. Inside, you and your household are already leaning towards spring, even while winter's shadow stretches behind you, not quite ready to vanish, but no longer quite able to command the whole horizon. By the time the ground is ready for the first cautious cuts of the plough, winter has become something you can almost look at sideways instead of straight on. It still nips at your fingers in the morning, still sends a thin mist of breath from your lips, but you feel it loosening like an old cloak slipping from your shoulders. In that in-between moment when you can still see patches of old snow in the shadow of hedges, even as mud squelches underfoot, you find yourself listening more closely to the people who have seen more winters than you. The elders of the village move slowly, but their memories move quickly. You watch an old man back-bent from years of lifting sacks and guiding ploughs, shuffle to the edge of a strip field. He presses the heel of his boot into the soil, lifts a clod, and crumbles it between his fingers. Better than in the year, when the frost held until after Lady Day, he mutters, naming March 25th, the Feast of the Annunciation, still used in many places to mark the new year. You've heard him say it before, but now, with the cold easing, you hear the layers inside the remark. The year when sowing was late, when harvest was poor, when winter seemed to leak into spring. Around the hearth in the evenings, they talk more openly now that the worst is passing. An old woman, hands knotted but still deft with spinning, tells again of the great hunger years, when she was a child, the heavy rains of 1315, and the failed harvests that followed, when they boiled weeds and bark and still went to bed hungry. She doesn't know the dates the way a clerk in a monastery might, but she knows the taste of those years, the way the air in the village felt thin and crackling with fear. Monastic chroniclers write of that great famine with words like unheard-of misery. She remembers it as a mother hiding crumbs for her children, and a father looking at the sky with hollow eyes. Others recall the plague that came later, in the late 1342, or in a renewed outbreak when they were young. Carts rumbling toward the churchyard day after day, doors marked or watched, the air thick with the smell of hastily buried bodies. Hello, I'm delighted to assist you with our voice services. Choose a voice that resonates with you, and let's begin our creative audio journey together. Someone else teaches you where to stuff moss in the wall to stop a particular draft that has always found that gap. A woman explains why she hangs a certain old cloak over the door only on the coldest nights because her mother did, and her mother before her, and they all said it kept the sickness out, though perhaps it simply cut the wind. Old proverbs peg weather to saints' days and dates. If Candlemas comes fair and bright, well have winter for another flight, an elder says, squinting at the memory of clear or cloudy skies on February 2nd. Another claims that a thaw before St. Gregory's Day is no good sign, or that thunder in February means a poor harvest. Modern scholars, examining tree rings and ice cores, reconstruct climate shifts with tools no one here can imagine. They also sift through such sayings, trying to hear in them generations of close attention to weather and survival. Some argue that the proverbs reflect genuine patterns, others that they are more about giving shape to uncertainty than about accurate prediction. Sitting here, you sense that both are true. They are attempts to make sense of a world where the stakes are high and control limited. There are practical inheritances too, ways of organizing work that you realize are as much tradition as necessity. The order in which fields are ploughed, the unspoken agreement about whose oxen lead down the strip, the shared understanding of how many days wood must be in before All Saints' Day, in November. These are all parts of a knowledge system that lives in people rather than in books. When you ask why something is done a particular way, the answer is often simply, because that's how my father did it, and his before him. Historians sometimes describe this as custom, a word that appears in manorial records and court rolls. In your ears, it sounds like a rope tying you back through time to people who faced the same winds. Children absorb all this, almost without noticing. A little boy mimics his grandfather's gesture when testing the soil, crumbling earth between small fingers as if he can already read next autumn in it. A girl watches her grandmother plait rushes into a mat, copying the pattern with clumsy hands until it becomes sure. They hear the stories of the hard winters of the time the river froze solid, of the year wolves came down into the outskirts of the village, and they file those stories away as both warning and reassurance. Bad years are real, they learn, but so is the fact that someone survived them long enough to sit here and tell the tale. Sometimes, a traveling preacher or a new local lord tries to impose different rhythms or rules, stricter fasts, different days for rents, new ideas about how fields should be worked. The elders listen, weighing the proposals against what memory says. They are not always passive. In some places, they push back, insisting on the weight of how things have always been done. In others, they adapt, folding new practices into the old fabric, judging by results whether stores last through winter, whether bellies feel a little less empty in March than they did in their parents' time. Scholars argue over how much agency medieval peasants truly had in shaping their own conditions. But when you watch an old man quietly redirect a younger lord's grand scheme into something more workable, you see that memory itself can be a form of power. The winter you have just walked through will, if you are lucky, join this chain. Years from now, you may be the one sitting by the hearth, telling younger faces about the cold that crept under the door that year, or the time we thought the child would not survive, but they did, or the winter when the grain bins were so low we measured flour by the pinch. You will edit as you go, emphasizing some details, softening others, turning months of fear and slog into a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. That is not a lie. It is a way of giving shape to what might otherwise feel like a blur of grey, cold days. As you stand once more at the cottage door, looking out over fields that are beginning to shine with damp, tilled soil, you realize that survival here is not just a matter of firewood, blankets, and grain. It is also a matter of remembered winters, of knowing that others have walked through hungry gaps, plagues, and famines, and found, if not safety, at least a path. Historians read charters, court rolls, and chronicles, trying to reconstruct that path. You read it in the lines on your elders' faces, in the way they talk about certain years in a lower voice, in the tricks of hand and habit they hand you, without always being able to explain why. Behind you, inside the low, smoky house, All the strategies you've seen, shared beds, animals indoors, careful rationing, work by firelight, stories and charms, faith and frustration settle back into their places as the season turns. Outside, the sky is still pale, the air still cool, but the worst of this particular winter has slipped into memory, joining the layered archive of winters before it. You step out toward the field, carrying with you not only your tools, but the weight and comfort of generations who have faced the cold and quietly, stubbornly, refused to let it have the last word. Now, the story begins to dim, like embers settling under a soft fall of ash. The cottage that has been so vivid in your mind, the rough door, the smoke-blackened rafters, the cramped pallet of straw fades back into the distance, taking with it the muffled coughs, the clatter of wooden spoons, the soft animal breaths from the byre. You feel the winter sky of centuries ago slowly lift away, replaced by whatever darkness surrounds you right now. A quiet bedroom, the glow of a screen that's about to go dark, the familiar contours of your own blankets. The noises of medieval life grow faint. The bell from the parish church, the creak of cartwheels on frozen ruts, the murmur of Latin in a cold stone nave. In their place comes a softer hush, perhaps the faint hum of modern traffic far away, the gentle ticking of pipes, or simply the sound of your own breathing, steady and calm. The fears that hung over those winters, empty grain bins, biting winds, sudden illness belong firmly to the past. They are stories now, folded into books and museum labels, into the careful notes of historians, into this long, sleepy narration you've just walked through. You, here, are not standing in a one-room cottage with frost creeping under the door. You are wrapped in your own layers, under your own roof, with warmth close at hand. Outside your window, whether it is night or early morning, the world is much gentler to human bodies than it was in those fields and lanes. You can let the weight of their struggles stay where it belongs, back there, across the centuries, while you borrow only the quiet, the firelight, and the sense that people have always, somehow, made it through the dark season. Imagine the last candle in that village church being snuffed out, the smoke curling up towards stone arches before disappearing. Picture a narrow medieval street emptying, footsteps fading, shutters drawn tight, while snow muffles the last sounds. See shelves of old chronicles resting in the dark of some distant library, ink that once described brutal winters now lying still and harmless on the page. Above all of it, above centuries of cold and fear and endurance, the sky remains, patient and calm. So you can let your own eyes grow heavy, knowing that the worst of those winters is over and far away, and that tonight you only have to drift, not to endure. Let the cottage door close gently in your mind. The embers dim to a soft, steady glow. The wind outside soften to a distant hush. Let yourself sink into your own bed, as if it were that deep pile of straw and patched wool, but safer, warmer, quieter by far. And as history closes its heavy books for the night, the quiet stars of another age watch over your dreams,